What would you do if a stranger showed up at your door in the middle of the night, soaking wet, desperate, and asking you to marry them by morning? Most people would slam the door shut. Mason Cole opened it wider. One exhausted rancher, one powerful CEO with everything to lose, a courthouse wedding neither of them planned, and a fake marriage that started falling apart in all the right ways. This is the story of two broken people who thought they were saving a business, and ended up saving each other instead. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. If this hits you somewhere real, hit that like button. Let's go. The storm had been building since late afternoon. Mason Cole could tell by the way the horses got restless around 4 o'clock, the way his old mare, Duchess, kept pacing the fence line and snorting at the southwestern sky, even though there wasn't a single cloud visible yet. Animals always knew. They picked up on the pressure dropping, the air tightening, the way the whole world seemed to hold its breath right before something broke loose. By 7, the clouds had swallowed the horizon whole. By 9, the Texas Hill Country was getting hammered. Mason stood on the covered porch and watched lightning rip sideways across the sky, the kind that lit everything up silver for a full 2 seconds before the thunder followed. A low rolling concussion that you felt in your back teeth more than heard. Rain came down in sheets, not drops, each gust carrying it sideways in waves that bent the old cedar trees at the edge of the property like they were made of paper. It was a bad one, the kind of storm that found every gap in a fence, every loose shingle, every place where the land hadn't been properly maintained, the kind of storm that reminded a rancher exactly how much he hadn't gotten around to fixing. Mason had a mental list. It was long. He pulled his flannel collar tighter and turned back toward the house. The kitchen light was on inside, warm and yellow through the window, and he could see the half-eaten bowl of mac and cheese still sitting on the counter. Emma's dinner, abandoned when she'd fallen asleep on the couch around 8:30. She was 6 years old and had the sleep schedule of someone who had worked hard all day, which, in fairness, she kind of had. She'd spent the afternoon helping him mend a section of fence near the north pasture, handing him tools with very serious concentration and informing him that she was basically a ranch hand now. He'd agreed with her completely. He turned off the porch light, checked the front door lock out of habit, and was reaching for the lamp switch in the living room when the knocking started. Not knocking, actually, pounding. 3 hard hits, like someone using the side of their fist instead of their knuckles. The kind of knock that said, "This is urgent," before you even opened the door. Mason stood still for a second. It was past 10 o'clock. His ranch sat at the end of a 2-mile dirt road. Nobody drove out here by accident, and nobody who knew him would show up unannounced in the middle of a storm like this without calling first. He glanced at his phone on the counter. No missed calls, no texts. The pounding came again, harder. He crossed the living room, sidestepped the stack of bills on the coffee table that he'd been ignoring for 3 days, and opened the front door. The woman standing on his porch looked like she'd driven through the storm with her window down. Her hair was soaked flat against her face and neck, dark strands plastered across her cheekbones. Her blazer, some expensive-looking charcoal gray thing, was soaked through and hanging off one shoulder. She was wearing heels, which had to be an 1.5 inches of mud-caked misery right now. One hand was gripping the porch railing like she wasn't sure she trusted her legs. She was shaking. Could have been cold, could have been something else. "Mason Cole?" she said. Her voice was steadier than the rest of her looked. He'd give her that. "Yeah," he said slowly. "My name is Olivia Bennett." She paused, just for a beat, like she was bracing herself for what came next. "I need to talk to you. I know how this looks. I wouldn't be here if I had any other option." Mason looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come inside," he said, "before you catch pneumonia on my porch." She stood in his entryway and dripped onto the welcome mat while he grabbed a towel from the hall closet, a clean one, or clean enough, and handed it to her without a word. She took it with both hands and pressed it against her face, and for a second he thought she might actually be crying behind it. But when she pulled it away, her eyes were just wet from the rain, dark circles under them, mascara slightly smeared. She looked exhausted in the way people looked when they'd been running on adrenaline for too long, and the tank was finally reading empty. "Thank you," she said. He nodded toward the kitchen. "You want coffee?" "Please." He moved to the counter and started the machine, and she followed him in, stopping at the edge of the kitchen like she wasn't sure if she had permission to come any further. He watched her take in the room, the worn laminate counters, the mismatched cabinet doors, Emma's crayon drawings stuck to the fridge with fruit-shaped magnets, the stack of overdue bills he hadn't put away. He didn't apologize for any of it. "Sit down," he said, pulling out one of the kitchen chairs. She sat. He leaned against the counter with his arms crossed and waited while the coffee machine gurgled and hissed and the rain hammered the window above the sink. "The Bennett Corporation," she started. "I don't know how much you know about it." "Cattle and land management, mostly," Mason said. "Family operation out of San Antonio. Your father ran it for about 30 years. She blinked. "You know who we are." "I know most of the major ranching operations in the state. It's not a big world." He paused. "Your father passed about 6 months ago, Raymond Bennett." 7 months, she said quietly. 7 months and 4 days. He didn't respond to that. Just let it sit there because some things didn't need a response. She pulled in a slow breath. He left a will. Most of it was standard. Assets, property, company shares. Her hands were flat on the table, fingers spread slightly, like she was pressing them down to keep them steady. But there was a condition attached to my inheritance of operational control. One specific condition. She met his eyes. "I have to be married before the end of the week." The coffee machine beeped. Mason turned around, poured 2 mugs, and set one in front of her. He stayed standing. "End of the week," he repeated. "Thursday, 6 days from now." Her jaw tightened slightly. "If I'm not married by then, operational control of the company, the ranches, the contracts, the properties, all of it, transfers to my brother, Damien. And you don't want that. Damien will sell everything within a year. The land, the livestock, the workers' contracts, everything my father built over 3 decades. He'll strip it down for parts and pocket the money, and every family that depends on our operation will be left with nothing." She stopped. "I've been working at that company since I was 22. I know every inch of it. I know the workers by name. I know which suppliers are reliable and which ones need watching. I know how to protect what my father built." Her voice didn't crack. "Damien knows how to read a balance sheet and make it look good to investors for about 18 months before the whole thing falls apart." Mason pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Why me?" he said. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Because I need someone who won't make this into something it isn't. Someone who understands land, understands ranching, understands that there's actual work involved in this, and it's not glamorous." She paused. "And because I've been through 12 names in the last 48 hours, and you're the only person I trust enough to actually ask." "You don't know me," Mason said. "I know your reputation. I know you ran the Callaway operation for 3 years after old Tom Callaway had his stroke, and you kept it profitable and kept every worker on payroll until his son was ready to take over, and you never asked for more than you'd agreed to. I know you've been running your own place alone for the past 4 years." A slight pause. "I know what happened to your wife." The kitchen got quieter, or maybe the storm just picked that moment to ease up a little. Mason looked at her steadily. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Marry me," she said. "On paper. Courthouse, license, legal. It satisfies the will's condition. I keep control of the company. I protect my father's legacy. I protect the workers and the land." She held his gaze. "In return, I'll pay off your outstanding ranch debt. All of it. The equipment loans, the operating line, whatever's on that stack on your coffee table." She'd clocked it on the way in. He'd noticed. "And I'll set up a trust for your daughter. College, whatever she needs." Mason said nothing for a long moment. Outside, a branch cracked somewhere in the dark, and the rain picked up again, drumming against the roof like it had something to prove. "You'd move in here?" he said. "I'd need to establish residency." "Yes." "My daughter's here. She's 6. "I know." She's been through enough already without watching adults play house and then walk away from each other. Olivia's expression didn't shift, but something in her eyes did, just slightly, like his words had landed somewhere real. "I understand that concern. I do. And I won't pretend I have a clean answer for it." She set her mug down. "All I can tell you is that I'll be honest with her about what I am. Someone staying for a while. I'm not going to try to be something I'm not." Mason studied the surface of his coffee. The honest truth, and he wasn't proud of it, was that he'd been staring at those bills for 3 weeks, and he didn't have a clear path out of them. The drought last summer had cut his hay yield by 40%. He'd had to buy supplemental feed at prices that made his stomach hurt. The old tractor had needed a repair in October that had wiped out what was left of his operating cushion, and now he was 2 months from having a real conversation with the bank that he was not looking forward to having. He'd built this place up from nothing after Sarah died. He'd done it by himself, sleep-deprived and grieving and functioning on stubbornness and the specific terror of failing his daughter. He was not going to lose it. But this? I need a minute, he said. Of course. He stood up and walked out onto the porch again, back into the wet and the noise of the storm. The rain was cold, and the air smelled like wet earth and ozone, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked out at the dark shapes of his property. The barn, the fence lines, the old cedar trees, and thought about his daughter sleeping on the couch inside, and about a woman at his kitchen table who was desperate enough to drive 2 hours in a storm to knock on a stranger's door. No lies between us, he thought. That's the only way this works. He went back inside. Olivia was still at the table, both hands around her mug, staring at the surface of the coffee like it held the answer to something. She looked up when he came in, and she didn't look hopeful exactly, more like she'd already started making peace with no and was trying to hold herself together through it. One condition, Mason said. She waited. No lies. About anything. Not to me. Not to my daughter. Not to the people around us. He pulled the chair out and sat back down. I don't care what it costs us with Damien or with your investors or with whoever else is watching. If we're going to do this, we do it straight. The moment I find out you've lied to me about something that matters, we're done, regardless of what's at stake. Olivia looked at him for a long moment. Agreed, she said. I mean it. So do I. He extended his hand across the table. It was a ridiculous thing to do, probably, shaking hands to agree to get married, but it felt right. It felt like the kind of thing that meant something. She took his hand and shook it once, firmly. Okay, Mason said. Then we need to be at the county clerk's office when it opens tomorrow morning. He made up the guest room for her, the one that had been his office, sort of, though calling it an office was generous, since mostly it was where boxes went to wait for a decision about them. He cleared enough floor space for the air mattress and found a set of sheets that weren't mismatched, which felt like a small victory. Olivia had a single bag in her car. He'd expected more, given the luggage tags and the general expensiveness of everything on her person, but she said the rest would come later, after. He didn't ask after what exactly. She closed the guest room door at around 11:30, and Mason went back to the living room to carry Emma to her actual bed. His daughter made a soft, protesting sound when he picked her up but didn't wake, just pressed her face against his shoulder and went boneless in the way only deeply asleep children could. He carried her to her room and tucked her in, and she was out again before he'd pulled the covers up. He stood in her doorway for a moment, looking at her, at the mess of dark hair on the pillow, the small hand curled near her face. The Dolly Parton is my hero poster she'd inexplicably demanded he hang above her bookshelf. Emma had strong opinions about Dolly Parton. He didn't question it. She's been through enough already, he'd told Olivia. That was true. Emma had been 2 when Sarah died, too young to remember much, though she asked questions sometimes, careful little questions that suggested she was working something out internally. She'd grown up in a house with one parent and a rotating cast of neighboring ranch wives who brought casseroles and checked in and meant well, and she was fine. She was good, actually. She was one of the funniest, most self-possessed little people he'd ever met, and she drove him absolutely crazy, and he would walk through fire for her without hesitating, which was exactly why standing in that doorway right now felt complicated. He'd made a decision that was going to change Emma's world in ways he couldn't fully predict. And he'd made it in about 45 minutes at a kitchen table during a thunderstorm. And the thing about being a single parent was that there was no one to check those decisions with. No one to say, "Are you sure about this?" No one to catch you when you misjudged. He was usually sure about things before he did them. He wasn't sure about this, but he also thought about Raymond Bennett, a man he'd never met but whose reputation was solid throughout the Texas ranching community. And the idea of that man's life's work being dismantled by someone who saw it as nothing more than a profitable transaction. And he thought about the workers on those properties, real people with families and mortgages and reasons to need their jobs. And he thought, If he was being completely honest with himself about the woman sitting in his guest room who had driven 2 hours in a storm because she was out of options and she was trying to hold something together that mattered. He turned off Emma's lamp and went to bed. He was up at 5:30, which was normal. The storm had cleared overnight and left behind the particular clean cold that came after heavy rain. Everything smelling like wet cedar and fresh mud. The sky a pale gray pink in the east. The air sharp enough that he could see his breath. He fed the horses first, checked the fence line near the south pasture where he'd heard something give in the storm, found a section of wire that needed retensioning, but nothing catastrophic. The cattle were in the lower field, unbothered, standing around with the vaguely philosophical expressions cattle always had in early morning. He was back at the house by 7, boots on the porch, when the guest room door opened and Olivia came out. She changed into clean clothes, dark jeans, a simple cream-colored blouse, her hair pulled back. She'd washed the storm off herself, but she still looked tired, the kind of tired that a night's sleep hadn't touched because it came from somewhere deeper. She was carrying a folder. Of course she was carrying a folder. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She glanced toward the hall. "Is your daughter still asleep? She'll be up by 8. My neighbor Carla is going to come by and watch her while we go to the clerk's office." Olivia nodded. "I have the application documents and the ID verification." She held up the folder slightly, then seemed to realize she was doing the thing where she led with logistics before anything else. She set it on the counter. "I can make breakfast, if that would be helpful." He looked at her. "I'm not helpless," she said, a hint of something defensive in it. "Didn't say you were. There are eggs in the fridge." She found the eggs. She found a pan. She made scrambled eggs that were technically fine, slightly overcooked, not quite enough salt, and he made toast and coffee without comment, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table in the early morning quiet and ate without talking much. And it was strange, the domestic ordinariness of it, given that in a few hours they were going to a courthouse. Emma came down at 7:45 wearing one sock and an expression of pure betrayal because someone had moved her stuffed rabbit off the couch. "It's on your bed," Mason told her. "Why?" "Because I carried you to bed last night." Emma considered this. "Okay," she decided, and climbed into her chair. Then she noticed Olivia. She stared at her with the specific unfiltered directness of small children, the kind that adults spent years learning to edit out of themselves. "Who are you?" Emma said. "Emma," Mason said. "She's in our kitchen," Emma pointed out, reasonably enough. Olivia set down her fork and looked at Emma with the same directness Emma was giving her. "My name is Olivia. I'm a friend of your dad's. I'm going to be staying here for a little while." Emma processed this. "Do you like horses?" "I don't have a lot of experience with them," Olivia said honestly. "I'm hoping to learn." Emma seemed to find this answer acceptable. She picked up her fork and started eating. "We have 4, she informed Olivia. "Duchess is the best one. She's very smart. Buck is kind of dumb, but we love him anyway." "That's a fair assessment," Mason said. Olivia almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Okay. Carla Torres arrived at 8:15 carrying coffee for herself and reading Mason's face in about 4 seconds flat, the way she'd been doing for years. She was 62 and had been his closest neighbor since before Emma was born, back when Mason and Sarah had first bought the property. She'd shown up with a casserole the week after Sarah's funeral and had been showing up ever since, not with pity, but with the kind of pragmatic, no-nonsense presence that Mason found more useful than sympathy. She looked at Olivia. She looked at Mason. She looked at the folder on the counter. "Going to the clerk's office?" she said. "Yeah," Mason said. A pause. "You sure about this?" "No," he said. Carla considered that. "Okay," she said finally, and kissed Emma on the top of the head and told her they were going to teach her dog, Biscuit, a new trick while Daddy was out. Emma immediately forgot everything else in the room. The county clerk's office opened at 9. It smelled like old paper and industrial cleaning product and something faintly floral that was probably an air freshener trying and failing to compensate. The clerk who processed their application was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the expression of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by approximately none of it for at least a decade. She looked at Mason's ID, she looked at Olivia's ID, she looked at the completed application, which Olivia had clearly filled out in advance with the specific thoroughness of someone who left nothing to chance. Texas requires a 72-hour waiting period, the clerk said. We're aware, Olivia said. We submitted for a waiver based on extenuating circumstances. I have the documentation. She produced it from the folder. The clerk read it again, set it down. I'll need to verify with the supervisor. Of course, Olivia said. They waited on a wooden bench in the hallway. The fluorescent light above them buzzed intermittently. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was making copies. Mason sat with his forearms on his knees and studied the floor tiles, and Olivia sat beside him with her back straight and the folder on her lap and her hands very still, and for a while neither of them said anything. You doing okay? He asked finally. She turned her head to look at him, like the question had surprised her. Yes, she said. Then, after a second, no, not really. She looked back at the corridor. This isn't what I imagined getting married would look like. No, he agreed. I'm not. I want to be clear that I'm not asking you to pretend it's something it isn't. She said it carefully, like she'd been thinking it over. I know what this is. I know you do, he said. A pause. The copier down the hall beeped. I know what it isn't too, she said, quieter. I'm not confused about that. Mason didn't respond to that one because there wasn't anything to say to it that wouldn't have been either dishonest or premature, and he'd promised himself he wasn't doing dishonest. The clerk came back 20 minutes later with the supervisor, a quiet, careful man who read the documentation a second time, asked Olivia 2 clarifying questions about the will's specific language, and then looked at both of them over the tops of his glasses. This is unusual, he said. Yes, sir, Mason said, but it appears to be in order. He signed something, handed it back to the clerk, and left without further comment. 35 minutes later, in a small room with beige walls and a dying plant in the corner, a justice of the peace named Gerald Watts, who had a kind face and the slightly hurried manner of a man with a full calendar, read them the civil ceremony words, short, direct, no music, no flowers, no one in the chairs that lined the room's edges. Do you take this woman? Do you take this man? I do. I do. There was a moment, right after the words were said, where Mason looked at Olivia and Olivia looked at Mason, and the fluorescent light hummed overhead, and the justice of the peace congratulated them with professional warmth, and the whole thing felt both completely real and completely impossible at the same time. The way sometimes reality outpaced your ability to process it, and all you could do was stand there and let it happen. Olivia's hand was cold when he shook it. He hadn't thought about whether there would be rings. Neither had she, apparently, because that part just didn't happen. Gerald Watt shook both their hands and moved on to his next appointment. They walked out into the cold November morning in silence, down the courthouse steps to the parking lot where their 2 trucks were parked side by side. Mason's older, muddier, slightly battered. Olivia's newer, clean, the kind of practical that had been chosen by someone who knew what working vehicles needed to be. So, Olivia said. So, Mason said. She looked at him. The sun was up now, pale winter light on her face, and she looked, he searched for the word, stripped down somehow. Like the version of her that had arrived on his porch last night had been operating on something close to pure performance, and now the performance had run out, and what was left was just a person, exhausted and uncertain and trying not to show it. Thank you, she said. And she said it simply, without the corporate gloss, without the careful framing, just those 2 words, flat and sincere. Mason nodded. Follow me back to the ranch, he said. And tonight, I'll teach you what chores need to happen before dark. She blinked. Tonight? We're ranchers, he said. The cattle don't care that we just got married. He got in his truck. After a moment, he heard Olivia's engine start behind him. When they got back to the ranch, Carla was on the porch with coffee, watching Emma throw a tennis ball for Biscuit with the intense concentration of someone engaged in serious work. She looked at Mason when he got out of the truck, and then at Olivia getting out of the car behind him, and she kept whatever she was thinking to herself. But she handed Mason his coffee mug, the one with the cracked handle that he wouldn't throw away. And she said quietly, "You call me if you need anything. Anything at all." "I know," he said. "I mean it, Mason." "I know you do." She left around noon, and the house settled into a strange, new quiet. 3 people occupying a space that had been built for 2, navigating around each other with the careful politeness of people who didn't yet know each other's rhythms. Emma, who had no capacity for awkward silences, immediately began showing Olivia things. The horses first. Mason watched from the fence as his daughter led Olivia along the paddock, pointing out each animal with the authority of a docent. Olivia followed, heels traded for the spare boots Mason had found in the barn that more or less fit her, asking questions with what appeared to be genuine interest. Duchess is the smartest. Buck is the biggest. Pepper is the youngest. Rosie is old now, but she used to be the fastest. Olivia listened carefully to all of it. That afternoon, Mason showed her the ranch operations. Not all of it, just enough for now. The feeding schedule, the fence check routine, where the tools were, where the first aid kit was, what the emergency vet's number was, and why it was the most important number on the board. He didn't soften it or make it romantic. It was work, and he talked about it the way he talked about work. Olivia took notes, actual notes, on a small notepad she'd pulled from her jacket pocket. He hadn't expected that. "You don't have to memorize it the first day," he said. "I know," she said, writing something down. "I just don't want to ask you the same question twice." That night, after Emma was in bed and the ranch was buttoned down for the evening, Mason sat on the porch with a beer and the weight of a day that had contained too many seismic things to process all at once. He'd gotten married this morning, to a woman he'd known for less than 24 hours. He turned the bottle in his hands and thought about the stack of bills on the coffee table that would soon have an answer, about Emma's college fund that had never been funded, about the ranch he'd fought to keep alive through 4 years of doing everything himself, about a 6-year-old girl who'd fallen asleep tonight with a new person under her roof and hadn't seemed frightened by it at all, just curious, the way kids were when something new showed up in their world. He thought about Olivia at the kitchen table in the small hours of last night, hands pressed flat to the surface, holding herself together through sheer will. He thought, this is going to get complicated. He'd known that before he'd said yes, but knowing something in the abstract and living it were different animals entirely. The porch door opened and Olivia came out, 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one without asking if he wanted it and sat in the other chair, pulling her knees up slightly against the cold. They sat in silence for a while. The night was clear after the storm, stars spread thick and bright the way they only got this far from city lights. The horses were quiet in the paddock. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called and was answered. "I talked to my lawyer today," Olivia said. "Damien's already filed a preliminary challenge to the will's conditions. He'll claim the marriage was arranged specifically to satisfy the legal requirement and therefore doesn't meet the spirit of the clause. Can he win that argument? He can try. He probably will try." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "He'll be watching us. He'll try to find anything that looks like this isn't real." Mason looked at the sky. "Then we make sure it's real." She turned her head toward him. "Not a performance," he said. "Not a show for investors. We live here. We work here. We treat each other like actual adults in an actual arrangement, and we don't give him a clean angle." He paused. "Which means you're doing the morning cattle check with me tomorrow, 5:45. Olivia was quiet for a moment. 5:45, she repeated. "A.M., he confirmed. Another pause. "Right," she said. The coyote called again in the dark, and the stars were clear and cold overhead, and the ranch sat quiet around them under the vast Texas sky, and neither of them said anything else for a while. Just 2 people sitting with the strange new weight of something that was already, in its way, more real than either of them had intended. That was day 1. They had no idea yet what was coming. The 5:45 alarm was not negotiable. Mason was already up when it went off. He'd been up since 5:15, because that was when his body had decided morning started, regardless of what anyone thought about it. He was in the kitchen pulling on his second layer when he heard the alarm sound in the guest room. Then a muffled thud that was either Olivia hitting the nightstand or the floor, followed by silence. He poured 2 coffees. He waited. She came out at 5:52, wearing dark work pants and a fleece pullover, hair pulled back in a low knot, eyes carrying the specific expression of someone who had been awake for approximately 7 minutes and was operating on principle rather than function. She took the coffee he held out without a word. "You're late," he said. "It's been 7 minutes," she said, voice flat. "Cattle don't run on your schedule." The cattle, she said, wrapping both hands around the mug, are cows. They will be cows in 7 minutes. Technically, they're... You know what? Let's go. She followed him out into the cold boot heels on the porch steps, breath visible in the dark air. The ranch in the early morning was a different animal than it was at noon. Quieter, older somehow, the land still holding the dark even as the horizon started bleeding color. Olivia stopped for just a second at the bottom of the steps and looked out at it, and Mason noticed but didn't say anything. He handed her a flashlight and they walked to the lower field. The morning check wasn't complicated. Count heads, check the water troughs, scan for anything that looked wrong, limping, isolating, off their feed. Mason moved through it the way he moved through everything, methodically, without drama. He pointed out what he was looking for and why as he went, not condescending, just explaining, the same way he'd explain anything to anyone who needed to know it. Olivia listened. She asked questions that were, to his mild surprise, genuinely practical. Not polite questions, not questions designed to look engaged, actual questions about why the cattle bunched a certain way in cold mornings, whether the trough heaters were on a timer or had to be manually checked, how you told the difference between a cow being antisocial and a cow being sick. Antisocial cow usually still has her ears up, he said. Sick cow, ears drop, eyes go dull. Different kind of stillness. Olivia looked at the nearest animal with new attention. That one's ears are up, she said. That one's fine, she's just not a morning person. Olivia made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but it had the shape of one. By the time they got back to the house, Emma was up and had made herself cereal with a concerning amount of sugar and was sitting at the table reading a library book about dolphins with complete absorption. She looked up when they came in. You went to check the cows, she told Olivia. You're wearing mud. Olivia looked down at her boots. Yes. That's good, Emma said, and went back to her book in the tone of someone distributing a passing grade. Olivia looked at the boots, then at Mason. He kept his face straight. She sat down across from Emma and wrapped her hands around what was left of her coffee and didn't say anything, but there was something in her posture that had shifted slightly, like a door that had been held shut with some effort had eased open just a fraction. That was how the first week worked itself out. Not smoothly, not comfortably, more like two people in a small space slowly learning not to knock into each other. They found a rhythm that was functional, if nothing else. Mason did what he always did. Olivia moved into that routine with the careful discipline of someone who was genuinely trying. She was up every morning at 5:45. She stopped being late by the third day. She started setting the coffee herself on the fourth. She also worked. That part surprised him more than anything. He'd half expected her to treat the ranch as a backdrop, somewhere she was technically living while she managed her real life remotely from a laptop. And she did have the laptop, and she was on calls regularly, and there were hours when she disappeared into the guest room with a closed door and emerged looking like she'd been in a fight. But she also showed up. Every morning check, every afternoon task he mentioned needing to get done. She didn't ask to be excused from any of it. She wasn't good at it, not yet. She asked too many questions sometimes and not enough at others. She misjudged the weight of a bale and dropped it on her own foot, which produced a very controlled expression of pain that told him she was absolutely not going to acknowledge how much it hurt. She put the wrong supplement in the wrong feeder one morning, and Mason caught it before any animals ate anything they shouldn't, and she said a single, very quiet word under her breath, and then fixed it without being asked, double-checking every other feeder while she was at it. She didn't make the same mistake twice. That was the thing he kept noticing. She made mistakes. She made several, but she learned them, really learned them, filed them somewhere, and didn't repeat them. It was the same quality that had probably made her a good CEO, just applied to a completely different context. Emma, for her part, was conducting what appeared to be an ongoing assessment. She wasn't hostile. She wasn't clingy either. Emma wasn't a clingy kid, never had been, which Mason sometimes thought was a 4-year adaptation to having only one parent around. She just watched. Careful, curious, taking inventory. She'd ask Olivia questions sometimes, out of nowhere, with the slightly interrogative quality of a child who had decided to find out what someone was made of. "Do you have a mom?" Emma asked one evening at dinner, fork suspended over her plate. Olivia looked up. "My mom passed away when I was 12. Emma thought about this. "My mom passed away too. I was too little to remember her very much." "I know," Olivia said, and she said it simply, without flinching from it, without trying to make it smaller or softer. That's a hard thing. Emma nodded, apparently satisfied. Do you like lasagna? I do. Daddy makes it wrong. He puts too much ricotta. I put the correct amount of ricotta, Mason said. Daddy thinks he's right about ricotta. Olivia pressed her lips together. How much ricotta does he use? So much ricotta, Emma said solemnly. Mason stared at his plate. I'm right here. Olivia met his eyes over the table, and this time she didn't almost smile. She actually did, just briefly, and it changed her face in a way that was hard to look away from, so he looked back down at his food instead. That was day 6. On day 8, Damien called. Mason was outside when it happened. He heard Olivia's voice through the kitchen window. Not the words, just the tone, which shifted within the first 20 seconds from carefully controlled to something with a harder edge underneath. He didn't go inside. He carried on with what he was doing, which was replacing a post in the north fence line that had been weakening since the storm. But he heard her come outside 20 minutes later, and he heard the way her boots on the gravel were slightly faster and harder than usual, and he heard her stop about 10 feet from where he was working. You okay? He said, without turning around. A long pause. He's bringing investors to tour 2 of our southeastern properties next week, without consulting me. He's framing it as a preliminary interest meeting, but it's a sell. He's already framing it as a sell. Mason drove the post setter down. Does he have the authority to do that? He has temporary consultation rights under the will's transition clause. He can show properties. He can't execute sales without operational approval, which is mine. She paused. But he's not trying to actually sell them next week. He's trying to demonstrate to the board that he has relationships and I don't. He's building a narrative. What's the narrative? That I'm scrambling, that I'm emotionally compromised from Dad's death, that I'm hiding out on a ranch with a man I barely know because I couldn't come up with a real solution. She said it flatly, not like she was venting, more like she was reading from a document. He'll say the marriage is theater. He'll say the workers are already losing confidence in me. Mason straightened up and looked at her. Her arms were crossed, jaw tight, eyes somewhere in the middle distance. She was wearing one of the flannel shirts she'd bought at the supply store in town last week. Practical, dark navy, nothing special. And she looked less like a CEO than she had when she'd arrived. Less polished, more real, more tired. Are the workers losing confidence in you? He asked. She looked at him. At the Bennett properties? Some of them don't know me well enough yet. Most of them worked for my father for years. Damien's been there in person telling them the company's in transition. She stopped. I've been here. Then go there, Mason said. I can't just... It's more complicated than that. If I go running back the second he makes a move, it looks reactive. It looks like he rattled me. Or it looks like you're doing your job, Mason said. He went back to the fence post. You said yourself you know every inch of that operation. You know the workers by name, so go there and be present. Don't go there because Damien pushed you into it. Go there because it's your company and that's what you do. He paused. And then come back. This ranch isn't going to run itself. Olivia was quiet for a moment, then, You're not going to tell me to be careful or think it through or, You've already thought it through 3 times, he said. You're looking for permission. I'm not going to give it to you because you don't need it. He glanced at her. Go to your company. She stood there for a moment, then she turned and went back toward the house, and he heard her on the phone before she even got through the kitchen door. She left the next morning before 7 and was back by 7 that evening. She came in with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been managing people and information and politics all day. And she sat down at the kitchen table and accepted the plate Mason slid in front of her without comment. And she ate like she'd forgotten to eat anything since breakfast, which she probably had. Emma was already in bed. The house was quiet. How did it go? Mason asked, sitting down across from her with his coffee. Olivia set her fork down and pressed the heel of her hand briefly against her forehead. It went. She pulled her hand down. Some of the foremen were relieved to see me. Some were waiting to see what I'd do. Damien's got one of the board members in his pocket. Harlan Whitmore, older guy, been on the board since before my father brought him on. He's been having private conversations with 3 other members. She looked up. He's building a block. Can he do anything with a block right now? Not until the legal deadline passes. But after that, if he can argue the marriage doesn't satisfy the condition, the board would have to weigh in on who assumes operational control. She picked up her fork again. He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to create enough doubt that the board makes the call themselves. He wants it to look like a legitimate governance decision, not a family power grab. Smarter than I expected, Mason said. Don't underestimate Damien, Olivia said. He's not good at the actual work. He never was, but he's very good at rooms. He knows how to work a room. So work your rooms better. She looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite exasperation, not quite amusement, somewhere in that territory. You're very direct, she said. It's a character flaw, he said. My late wife used to tell me that. A pause. It was the first time he'd mentioned Sarah in any kind of personal way since Olivia had arrived, and he heard it himself as soon as the words were out. Slightly unexpected, a door he hadn't planned to open. Olivia's expression shifted, carefully. She sounds like she knew you well. Better than I deserved, probably, he said. He stood up and refilled his coffee. You should sleep, 5:45. Yes, she said, and she didn't push on it, which he was grateful for. But that night, lying in the dark, he thought about how strange it was that Sarah's absence had its own shape in this house. Not heavy, exactly. Not the crushing grief of the first year or even the second, but present. Like something that had rearranged the furniture and you still noticed the new positions sometimes, even when you'd gotten used to them. He hadn't talked about her to anyone much lately. Not because it hurt too much, but because most people around him had gotten careful about it, the way people got careful around grief they assumed was still raw. Carla knew him well enough not to tiptoe, but most others did. Olivia hadn't gotten careful. She'd just listened and let him say what he said and moved on. He wasn't sure whether that was a skill or just who she was. Probably both. The next week was harder. The phone calls from Damien's legal team started, not to Mason directly, but to Olivia, and he could chart the pressure of them by the way she came out of the guest room after the calls. She never came out messy. That wasn't in her, but she came out quieter, or with a jaw set at a specific angle that meant she was holding something down. Once she walked straight out the back door and stood in the yard for 10 minutes in the cold before coming back in, and she said nothing about it. And he said nothing either. He started watching for those moments. Not to intervene. She didn't want intervention. That much was clear. But he started making sure there was coffee when she came back in, or that dinner was happening, or that Emma was somewhere nearby being 6 and loud and unconcerning in the way only children could be, because he'd noticed that Emma had a specific effect on Olivia that nothing else seemed to replicate. She just pulled Olivia out of her own head. Not intentionally, just by being Emma, who would not allow you to remain in a bad mood when she had a question about dolphins or an opinion about the ricotta situation or a very serious need for someone to watch her teach the dog a trick. Olivia had started teaching Emma card games in the evenings. Simple ones. War, Go Fish. Eventually, Rummy, with simplified rules that Emma immediately found ways to exploit. Mason would sit at the other end of the table pretending to read something while listening to them argue cheerfully about whether Emma's interpretation of the rules counted as cheating or innovation. It's cheating, Olivia said firmly. It's a strategy, Emma said. Cheating is not a strategy. It worked, didn't it? Emma? What? I'm not going to validate cheating just because it worked. Emma pointed her card at Olivia. You sound like Daddy. Olivia glanced at Mason. Don't look at me, he said, turning a page. I've been saying it for years. 2 weeks after Olivia had arrived, Mason drove out to the Harmon property to look at a used irrigation system a neighboring rancher was selling. He asked Olivia if she wanted to come. She said yes before he'd finished the sentence. They drove out in his truck, which meant 30 minutes of ranch roads and state highway with the radio turned low, and they talked about the irrigation system, and then about the drought cycles in the area, and then somehow about the way the Bennett land had been managed during the last bad drought year. And Olivia started talking about her father without seeming to plan it. He used to walk the fence lines himself, she said, looking out the window at the passing landscape. Even when the company was big enough that he had people who did that job, he'd still go out on Sunday mornings, just walk the fences himself. I asked him why once. She paused. He said the land tells you things when you're on it that it won't tell you from a desk. Mason kept his eyes on the road. He was right about that. I know that now. I didn't then. She was quiet for a moment. When I started at the company, I wanted to modernize everything. Streamline. There were inefficiencies, real ones. and I was 22 and I'd just gotten my degree and I was sure I could see things he was missing. She made a dry sound. He was very patient with me. Did you modernize it? Some things, the right things, eventually. Once I'd stopped being so certain about it. She turned her head slightly. He had a way of letting you figure out you were wrong without making you feel stupid about it. Just letting you run ahead until you hit the wall yourself, and then being there when you turned around. She stopped. I miss that. The truck hummed along the road. That's a good way to be a father, Mason said eventually. Olivia looked at him. You do that, she said, like it had just occurred to her. With Emma, you let her figure things out. He shrugged. She hates being told things. Easier to let her arrive at them herself. That's not easier. That's harder. It takes patience. She's worth it. Olivia looked back out the window. After a long moment, she said quietly, You're a good father, Mason. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. But it sat there between them for the rest of the drive in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, just real. Back at the ranch that afternoon, he found two of his hands, Rudy and Pete, working on the old tractor shed roof that had taken damage in the storm. He went to help, and Olivia came with him. The three men exchanged a look, the particular look of ranch workers who had been watching and forming opinions, and then Rudy, who was 61 and had seen everything and kept his own counsel about most of it, handed Olivia a hammer. She took it. She wasn't good at it. She hit a nail crooked twice and had to pull it and start over, and Pete, who was not subtle about anything, watched this with undisguised interest. But she didn't stop. She kept at it, steady and methodical, and after an hour she'd hammered out a full section of new roofing nails without asking for help. When they broke for water, Rudy handed her a bottle and said, You going to be around a while? That's the plan, Olivia said. Rudy nodded once. All right then. It was not a parade or a declaration or any kind of dramatic acceptance. It was just an old ranch hand deciding someone had enough to them to stick around, and saying so with 5 words. But Mason saw Olivia's shoulders drop a fraction, just a fraction, and knew it had meant something. What came next, though, hadn't been part of any plan. 2 weeks and 3 days in, Damien showed up. Not a phone call, not through lawyers. In person, at the front gate, with 2 cars behind him, and what Olivia later described as a calculated casualness that meant he'd planned every detail of it. Mason was the one who saw him from the barn. He didn't recognize the man at first. Just saw the cars, the way they'd stopped at the gate rather than coming up the drive, which was either politeness or calculation. Then Olivia came out of the house onto the porch and went very still. Damien, she said, quiet enough that Mason almost missed it. He walked up beside her. The man coming through the gate was tall, mid-40s, wearing the kind of casual clothes that cost enough to be obvious about it. He had the easy confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted himself, the kind that looked like authority from a distance and felt something different up close. He smiled when he saw Mason. It was a specific kind of smile. You must be the rancher, Damien said, offering his hand. Mason shook it, firm, brief. Mason Cole. Damien Bennett. He said it the way people said names they expected to carry weight. Then he turned to Olivia, and the smile shifted, warmer, almost brotherly, and completely hollow. Livy, I was in the area. Thought I'd stop by, see how the arrangement is working out. You weren't in the area, Olivia said. You drove 2 hours. I had meetings in Austin. He looked past her at the house. Nice place. Very... A pause. Slight. Rustic. Mason said nothing. He stood beside Olivia and said nothing, and he could feel her tension in his peripheral vision like a change in air pressure. Damien, whatever you want to say it and go, she said. Her voice was controlled, very controlled, in the way of someone managing something that wanted to move. Damien tilted his head slightly. I just want to make sure you're thinking clearly. You've had a hard few months, Livy. Dad passing, the will, all of this. His gesture took in the ranch and Mason and the whole situation without being direct enough about any of it to be attacked. I'm still your brother. I'm worried about you. You're worried about the company, she said. I'm worried about both, he said smoothly. A marriage to someone you barely know, living out here instead of being in San Antonio managing the operation. The board has concerns. I have concerns. He paused. You could still step back. I could maintain operational continuity while you take time to grieve properly. That's not a threat. That's an offer. Step back, Olivia repeated. Just temporarily. There was a moment, Mason saw it happen, where something passed across Olivia's face. Something that might have been doubt, or the ghost of it, or just the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting on too many fronts for too long and had a single moment of wondering whether it was worth it. It lasted about 2 seconds. Then her chin came up. This ranch, she said, is not temporary. My marriage is not theater. And the Bennett Corporation's land, its contracts, its workers, none of that is yours to manage, Damien. Not temporarily, not permanently. Dad trusted me with it, and I'm honoring that. She held his gaze. The answer is no. It has been no. It will continue to be no. And if you drive out here again without being invited, I'll have it documented as harassment. Something moved behind Damien's eyes. Not hurt. He hadn't been counting on sentiment, more like a recalibration. He looked at Mason, the way men sometimes looked at other men when they wanted to suggest something without saying it. You're good with all this? He said, like there was a this that Mason might have reservations about. I'm good, Mason said. Damien studied him for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and there was something in it that said this conversation wasn't over, just relocated. He walked back to his cars. The two vehicles turned around on the narrow drive with careful precision and pulled back out through the gate. The dust settled. Olivia stood on the porch steps, arms tight across her chest, staring at the empty gate. Her jaw was still set at that angle. Her hands were not quite steady. He's going to push harder now, she said. That wasn't to negotiate. That was reconnaissance. I know, Mason said. He wanted to see where we were, how solid it looked, whether I seemed rattled. She uncrossed her arms, seemed to make a deliberate decision to relax them. He'll go back and tell the board I'm isolated, that I'm living on a ranch playing house instead of running the company. Then we make sure you're running the company, Mason said. You've been going to San Antonio, what, twice a week? Make it 4. Take calls here in the morning, be there in the afternoons when you can. Be visible. He paused. And don't look rattled. She turned to look at him. I'm not rattled. I know you're not, he said, but he's going to try to make you feel like you are, because if you feel like it, eventually you start acting like it. He met her eyes. You know what you're doing, Olivia. You know that company. Don't let him get inside your head. She held his gaze for a moment, and something crossed her face that he couldn't quite name. Something slightly vulnerable behind the composed surface, quickly covered. He does that, she said quietly. He always could. Even when we were kids. She stopped. Damien was always better at making me feel like the ground wasn't solid under my feet. The ground's solid, Mason said. I laid some of that fence myself. It was a dumb thing to say, probably, overly literal, but Olivia let out a single, short, genuine laugh. The first actual laugh he'd heard from her. Not an almost smile, not a dry sound, but a real one. And it was apparently an unexpected enough thing for both of them that they both sort of stood there for a second in the aftermath of it. Okay, she said, pulling herself back together. 4 days a week, and home by 7, he said. You miss dinner and Emma will hold it against you. She's got a long memory. Olivia looked at him. Home, she repeated, catching the word the same moment he caught himself using it. Figure of speech, he said. She nodded, not pushing it, but the word had been said, and they both knew it. She went 4 days that week and 3 the next, and gradually the rhythm of it settled. Olivia present at the ranch every morning, out at the company through the day, back by evening, sitting at the table with Emma for card games while Mason cleaned up the dinner things. It wasn't a performance. It was just the shape of things. What their days had become. The workers on the ranch had stopped watching Olivia with the guarded uncertainty of the first week. Rudy called her by her first name now, which from Rudy was an entire personality endorsement compressed into 2 syllables. Pete had started telling her which gates needed watching before storms without being asked, which meant he'd accepted her as someone who needed to know things. The young hand named Cody, who was 23 and had strong opinions about everything and kept most of them to himself, had started nodding to her in the mornings, which Mason recognized as Cody's version of warmth. She wasn't one of them yet. You didn't become one of them in 3 weeks. But she'd stopped being a stranger, And in a working ranch crew, that was its own kind of progress. What Mason hadn't expected, and maybe should have, was how much he'd started paying attention to her. Not in the way of watching her to see what she'd do wrong or monitoring the situation, just noticing things. The way she held a coffee mug with two hands on cold mornings, like she was warming herself from the inside out. The way she answered Emma's questions with complete seriousness, no matter how strange the questions got. The way she'd sit on the porch some evenings when she thought he wasn't looking and just look at the land in the fading light with an expression he couldn't read. Not his land, not her land, just land. And something about it seemed to do something for her that the phone calls and the spreadsheets and the carefully constructed professional image never reached. He noticed the way she laughed when she laughed. Rare, still, but when it came out, it was real. Not a CEO's laugh, not a social laugh, just hers. And he noticed that there was a moment, sometimes toward the end of the day, when the professional composure settled down and she was just a person sitting in a kitchen. And she looked, not happy, not that simple, but less alone than she'd looked when she'd arrived. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with any of that, so mostly he didn't do anything. He just kept getting up at 5:15 and she kept being up by 5:45, and they kept walking the fence lines in the cold morning air while the sky turned colors overhead. And Emma kept losing at rummy in ways that somehow always turned out to be Olivia's fault according to Emma's accounting. And Damien's legal team kept calling, and the bills got paid, and the cattle were fine, and the land kept going. One evening, late, after Emma was down and Olivia had been on a call with her lawyers for 2 hours, and had come out of the guest room looking like she'd been wrung out and hung up, she sat down on the porch steps instead of in the chair. Just sat down on the steps, back against the porch column, knees up. Mason sat in the chair behind her. She didn't say anything for a long time. He didn't push. "He filed a formal challenge today," she said finally. "Damien, through the estate lawyers, he's arguing the marriage doesn't meet the spirit of the clause. He's got a legal brief and 3 affidavits." "Affidavits from who?" "People who are willing to testify they believe the arrangement is transactional. People he's been talking to." She paused. "One of them is someone I thought was on my side." That one landed visibly. Mason watched her absorb it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have seen it," she said, and the flatness in her voice was a different kind of flat than her professional tone, not controlled, just empty for a moment. "I know Damien. I know how he operates. I should have been watching that person more carefully. You can't watch everyone all the time." "No," she agreed, "but I picked wrong, and now I'm paying for it." She looked out at the dark. 12 years I spent at that company, 12 years learning every corner of it, and he's going to try to take it on the strength of a legal technicality and 3 people willing to sign their names. Mason leaned forward in the chair, forearms on his knees. "He's not going to take it," he said. She turned her head to look at him, and in the dark, in the low light from inside the house, her expression was unguarded in a way it almost never was. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he said, "but I know you. 3 weeks in, and I know you don't lose things you've decided to fight for." He held her gaze. "So fight for it." She looked at him for a long moment. 3 weeks, she said quieter. "Yeah. That's not very long." "No," he said, "it isn't." They sat there in the dark with the night sounds of the ranch around them, the horses quiet in the paddock, the wind moving low through the cedar trees, the stars doing what they always did out here, which was everything. And whatever was between them, unnamed, unaddressed, sitting in the space between a chair and the porch steps on a cold November night, it stayed there, patient, not demanding anything yet, just present, the way things were when they were real. The formal challenge from Damien's lawyers arrived on a Tuesday, printed on expensive letterhead and delivered by courier to the ranch gate at 9 in the morning, which was either coincidence or theater. Mason suspected theater. Olivia read it at the kitchen table while Emma was at school, and Mason sat across from her with his coffee. She read it the way she read most things, straight through, no expression, no reaction on the surface. When she finished, she set it face down on the table and stared at the far wall for a moment. "Well," she said. "How bad?" She turned it back over and read one section again. "He's arguing that the marriage fails to meet the will's condition because it was entered into as a contractual arrangement rather than a genuine domestic partnership. He's got language in the challenge that essentially says a courthouse wedding with no prior relationship, no cohabitation history, and no social history between the parties can't reasonably be interpreted as satisfying what his lawyers are calling the spirit of the testamentary intent. She set it down. He also has a deposition from someone at the county clerk's office saying we applied for an emergency waiver on the waiting period, which his lawyers are framing as evidence of urgency inconsistent with an organic relationship. Bam, chimem, teen. Can they get that deposition? Apparently. She rubbed the side of her jaw. It's not nothing. The argument has some structural logic to it, even if the motivation behind it is completely cynical. She paused. Our lawyers are filing a response this week, but the hearing isn't for another 3 weeks, and that's 3 weeks for Damien to keep building his case with the board. Mason looked at the letter. What does your lawyer say our strongest argument is? That the will's language doesn't specify a minimum relationship duration. It says married. We're married. The rest is interpretation. She tapped the letter once. But interpretation is where Damien lives. He's very good at interpretation. That was true, Mason had gathered. Damien Bennett operated entirely in the space between what was technically true and what could be made to look true. It was a particular kind of intelligence, and Mason didn't underestimate it, even though there was nothing admirable about it. So we need to close that space, Mason said. Olivia looked at him. He's arguing it's not real, Mason said, so we make it undeniable. Not a performance. You said yourself that won't work. But everything we're already doing, we do more of it in front of the right people. You bring me to San Antonio when it makes sense. You bring me when you meet with workers, or suppliers, or the board members you still have on your side. He paused. And you let the ones who matter see that this isn't theater. That could backfire, she said. If anyone reads it as staged, then it has to not be staged, he said. Which means you stop running everything through the question of how it looks and just actually let people see what's here. She looked at him for a moment, and he could see her working through the multiple angles of it the way she always did, running it forward, checking the exits, measuring the risks. What is here? She said, quiet. Not defensive, genuinely asking. Mason turned his coffee mug in his hands. 2 people who made a deal and have been trying to do right by it, he said. That's real. It's not nothing. Olivia held his gaze for another second, then looked back down at the letter. Okay, she said. I'll talk to our lawyers about the approach. She went to San Antonio that afternoon. She came back at 8, and Emma was still awake and had been waiting, which was unusual for Emma, who fell asleep like she was making a deliberate decision about it. She'd apparently decided tonight was not the night for that decision. You're late, Emma told Olivia from the couch, with the specific accusatory tone of a child who had opinions about schedules. I know. I'm sorry. Olivia sat down beside her on the couch, still in her work clothes, looking like the day had been long. Were you waiting for me? Emma shrugged with elaborate casualness that was entirely unconvincing. I just wasn't tired. Olivia leaned back on the couch. What are you watching? Nature documentary about wolves. Emma pointed at the screen with the authority of someone giving a tour. That one's the alpha. She's the mom. She runs the whole pack. Olivia watched the screen for a moment. She looks tired. She's been taking care of everyone all day, Emma said. That's why. Mason from the doorway watched Olivia absorb that, and watched something in her face go quietly soft. She stayed on the couch until Emma actually fell asleep, which took another 20 minutes, and then she sat there for a few minutes more, not moving, just sitting in the dark and the blue light of the muted television, and Mason didn't say anything. He just turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and left her to whatever she was working out. The following week, Damien made his next move, and he made it in person, which meant he'd decided that phone calls and legal letters weren't enough anymore. He came with 3 men, investors by the look of them, the kind who wore money quietly in the cut of their jackets and the way they looked at property like they were already calculating square footage. He didn't call ahead. He drove through the front gate at 11 in the morning on a Wednesday, when Mason was in the South Field and Rudy and Pete were working near the barn, and Olivia happened to be back from San Antonio early because a supplier meeting had been pushed. Mason saw the vehicles from the South Field and felt something tighten in the back of his chest. He started back toward the house at a pace that was not quite running but was close. Olivia had already come out onto the porch by the time he got there. She was standing at the top of the porch steps with her arms at her sides, not crossed, which took something because her natural response to Damien was to armor up. She'd made a deliberate choice not to. Damien was already out of his car, coming up the drive with the three men behind him, and he was performing something. A version of himself that was relaxed and reasonable and concerned, layered over whatever was actually going on underneath. "Olivia," he said, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. He looked up at her. "I brought some friends of the company. They've been wanting to understand the current situation." He paused. "I hope that's all right." "It's not all right," Olivia said, her voice even. "You're on my husband's property without an invitation, Damien. These men are not welcome here. You drove 2 hours with investors to stage a walkthrough of my living situation," she said. "That's not a social call, it's a stunt." She held his eyes. "And you know it." One of the investors, older guy, silver-haired, the kind of tan that came from somewhere warm and expensive, cleared his throat slightly. "Ms. Bennett, we understand there are some questions about the continuity of leadership at—" "The continuity of leadership," Olivia said, "is not in question. I am the operational head of Bennett Corporation. I've been doing that job every day from here and from San Antonio and from every supplier meeting and every worker review and every board call that's been scheduled in the past month." She came down one step, not retreating, moving toward them. "The questions aren't about continuity. They're about whether my brother can convince enough of you that I'm unstable enough to replace." She looked at the silver-haired investor. "How many times has Damien had dinner with you in the last 3 weeks?" The man didn't answer. "4, Olivia said. "I know because my lawyers asked." She looked at all three of them. "You're not here as neutral observers. You're here as part of a strategy. I'd encourage you to think carefully about what it means when that strategy fails, because it will fail, and the people who participated in it will be visible." Mason had reached the edge of the porch by now, and stopped there, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd her. He watched the investors recalculate. He watched Damien's jaw tighten fractionally. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Livy," Damien said, quiet now, dropping the performance tone for something that was maybe actually real, the irritation underneath. "I'm trying to protect the company." "You're protecting your share," she said. "You've never cared about the company. You never wanted to work there. You were furious when Dad chose me. You've been furious for 8 years. She held his gaze. "That's not protection, Damien. That's resentment with a business plan." Something moved across Damien's face. Fast, then gone. Covered back over. "The sale of the Kerrville property alone would—" "The Kerrville property has 23 families living on it," Olivia said. "Workers who have been with Bennett operations for over a decade. The Garcias, the Mendozas, the Thibodeau family. I know all of them by name. Their kids know our name." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "That land is not for sale. Not the Kerrville property, not the Blanco River parcels, not any of it. Not while I'm running this company." She looked at the investors. "And I am running this company. You can take that back to whoever sent you." What? The silver-haired investor looked at the other two. Something quiet passed between them. Damien held his ground for another 3 seconds, long enough to make it look like a choice to leave rather than a retreat, and then he said, "We'll be in touch through the lawyers," and turned back toward the cars. The investors followed. Mason watched Damien go and noted the specific way the man moved. Shoulders set, steps measured, everything controlled. He wasn't rattled. He'd gotten something out of this visit, even if it didn't look like it from the outside. Reconnaissance, Olivia had said after the first visit. He'd been watching this time too, and Mason didn't know what he'd seen, but he'd seen something. The cars turned and drove back down the road. Rudy had drifted over from the barn, making a show of checking something on the fence nearby. He didn't look at Olivia directly, but he said to no one in particular, "Ground still solid." Olivia turned to look at him. Rudy shrugged, still not looking at her. "Ranch is still standing, that's all." It was such a completely Rudy thing to say, blunt, understated, and somehow exactly right, that Mason almost smiled. Olivia stood at the foot of the porch steps for a moment after the cars were out of sight, and Mason saw it then. The thing that happened when the adrenaline started going out, the way her shoulders came down a half inch, and her breath evened out and she pressed her lips together and blinked a few times. She'd held herself together through the whole thing with complete composure, and now the composure was still there, but the effort behind it was visible, briefly, like seeing the scaffolding behind a finished wall. You okay? Mason asked. Give me a minute, she said. He gave her a minute. She stood there in the November sun with her face turned toward the south field, not looking at anything specific, just letting the air work. Then she took a breath, and something settled back into place, and she looked at him. He'll come back harder, she said. Yeah, he's going to go to the board now. He has enough from today. The way I spoke to the investors, the directness of it. He'll frame it as instability. Or strength, Mason said. Depends on who's watching and what they're looking for. Olivia looked at him. You think that was the right call? I think you said what was true, he said. Whatever it costs, that's worth more than performing something it isn't. He paused. You know those workers by name, Olivia. You said it out there like you knew it in your bones. That's not a strategy. That's who you are. She held his gaze for a moment longer than usual. Garcias, Mendozas, Thibodeau, she said quietly. Their kids know our name. I heard you. I meant it. I know you did, he said. That's what I'm saying. Something shifted in her expression. Subtle, but there. She looked at him with a kind of attention that felt different from the careful professional register she usually operated in, and he felt it, and he thought maybe she knew he felt it, and neither of them did anything about it. Because the cattle still needed checking, and Emma was getting off the school bus in 40 minutes, and Rudy needed help with a section of new fencing, and the day had to keep being the day. But it had happened. Whatever it was. The week that followed was the hardest one yet, and not because of Damien. It came on a Thursday, which was an ordinary day. Emma had come home from school in the late afternoon with a school project that needed a shoebox and some construction paper, and what she described as a lot of creative thinking. She'd spread her materials across the kitchen table with the focused energy of someone approaching a serious undertaking, and Olivia had sat down beside her without being asked, and spent the better part of an hour helping her figure out the diorama for her state history project. Mason had been in and out doing the evening chores, and every time he came back through the kitchen, they were still there. Emma explaining the historical context of the project in her particular blend of fact and embellishment, Olivia cutting construction paper with precise little scissors and asking follow-up questions like she was actually interested in the Battle of San Jacinto, which, for all Mason knew, she might have been. At dinner, Emma announced that Olivia was good at history stuff and should help with all future projects. I helped too, Mason pointed out. You said San Jacinto and then went to check on the horses, Emma said. Those horses needed checking. Olivia stayed. He looked at Olivia. She was looking at her plate. There was a faint something at the corner of her mouth. Fine, he said. Olivia stays for history projects. Later that night, after Emma was in bed and the dishes were done, Olivia came and found him in the barn, where he was doing a final check on Duchess, who'd been favoring her right front leg slightly since the afternoon, and he wanted to see if it had eased. Olivia came in without announcing herself and leaned against the stall railing, and for a moment she just watched him work. Her leg okay? She asked. I think it's just the cold. She gets stiff. He ran his hand down the leg carefully. Duchess turned her head and looked at him with the long, patient gaze of an old mare who had seen many things and found most of them acceptable. Can I ask you something? Olivia said. Yeah. What was she like? Sarah. The question came out carefully, not invasive, but real. He could hear that she'd thought about asking it for a while. He kept his hand on the horse's leg, working gently at the joint. Stubborn, he said. Funnier than she let most people see. She had strong opinions about food that she would debate at length. He paused. She was the kind of person who, if she told you something would be fine, you actually believed her. Not because she was soft about things, because she was usually right. Emma's like that, Olivia said. Yeah, he said. She is. The usually right part especially. Don't let her hear you say that. I'll never get her to listen to me again. Olivia almost smiled. Then she was quiet for a moment, and in the barn's warmth, with the horses breathing and the wind working at the far wall, she said, Do you miss her the same way you did, or does it change? He straightened up, rested his forearm on the top of the stall. Duchess nuzzled his shoulder. It changes, he said. It's not the same weight it was the first year. Now it's more like, he searched for it, like a room in the house you don't go into much anymore. It's still there. Everything in it still belongs to it. But you don't wake up and walk straight into it every morning. Olivia was looking at him with the careful attention she gave things that mattered to her. My dad is still mostly the first kind, she said, the walking straight into it every morning kind. 7 months, he said. Yeah, it'll be that for a while. Does it feel like a betrayal, moving forward? He looked at her. She'd asked it straight out, which was her way, no cushioning. She was asking because she actually needed to know. At first, he said. Yeah, but Sarah didn't want me stuck. That was never who she was. He looked at the horse. She would have thought it was stubborn and wasteful, actually, if I'm being accurate about her. Olivia let out a short, genuine sound that was close to a laugh. That's very honest. She was very honest, he said. It rubbed off. She looked at him for a moment more, and in the barn light there was something undefended about her face. The CEO, composure fully down, just a person who had lost her father and was carrying it quietly and had asked a real question because she needed a real answer. Thank you, she said. For what? For answering it like it was a real question. It was a real question, he said. She pushed off the railing. I'll see you at 5:45. Yeah, he said. She left. Duchess turned her head and watched her go, then looked back at Mason with what he was fairly sure was a horse expressing an opinion. Don't, he told her. Duchess was quiet. The storm came 11 days later. It built the same way the first one had. The restlessness in the horses that afternoon, the pressure dropping, the sky going the wrong color at the edges. But this one was bigger. The Weather Service put out an alert at 4 in the afternoon warning of severe thunderstorms with hail and sustained winds, and Mason spent the early evening securing everything that could move, tarps, tools, the section of tin roofing he'd been meaning to replace properly, and had propped up in the meantime, which was now a liability. Olivia worked beside him without being told to. Not in his way, not asking constantly what she should do, just moving from thing to thing and figuring it out, reading what needed doing and doing it. She'd come a long way from the woman who'd had to be shown which end of the feeder was which. Emma was inside, under firm instructions to stay there. By 8, the storm was on top of them. It was nothing like the first storm in its presentation, no drama of someone appearing at a door in the rain. This one was just weather, hard and indifferent, the kind that reminded you that ranching in Central Texas was sometimes a negotiation with a force that was not going to negotiate back. The call came from Rudy at 9:15. Mason answered on the second ring. He could barely hear Rudy over the wind. South Gate, Rudy was saying. Something gave. The gate. The line broke up. Mason moved before he'd entirely processed it. He grabbed his rain gear from the back door, pulled his boots on, and was already off the porch when he heard Olivia behind him. What happened? South Gate's down. Cattle might be on the highway. He heard her pull her own boots on. I'm coming. You don't have to. I know, she said. I'm coming. They drove to the south pasture in his truck, the headlights barely cutting through the rain, and the gate was down. The whole frame had given at the hinge side, which he'd had on his repair list for 2 months, which was going to be a thing he thought about later. Right now, 3 of his cattle were through it, and one of them was already in the road because they could see the shapes of her in the headlights of a truck that had stopped, hazard lights going. The driver was out, waving his arms. Mason was out of his truck before it fully stopped. What followed was an hour and 20 minutes of cold, mud, and managed chaos. The cattle were not interested in being helpful. 2 of the 3 came back through with enough encouragement and some feed. Pete had arrived with Rudy within 10 minutes, and they knew the animals well enough to work them. The third one, a younger steer named, with typical ranch practicality, Number 7, had made it 40 yards down the highway shoulder and had opinions about coming back. Olivia was in the road. She was soaked in under a minute, rain slanting sideways, wind pulling her hair out of whatever she'd tied it back with. She'd found a flashlight somewhere. She was walking a steady line between Number 7 and the tree line without making any sudden moves, keeping the animal contained on the shoulder rather than letting him panic into the far lane. She didn't have experience with this. She hadn't worked cattle in any real capacity until 3 weeks ago, and here she was in a highway rainstorm in the dark with a 1,000-pound steer that was scared and unpredictable, and she was doing the right thing. Calm, patient, reading the animal's body language and working with it rather than against it. It took Mason another 20 minutes to get a lead on Number 7, with Olivia holding the flashlight angle and talking low and steady in a way that kept the animal from bolting. When it was done and the steer was heading back through the repaired gap and Rudy was swinging the temporary gate shut, Mason stood in the rain and looked at Olivia. She was soaked through, mud up to mid-calf, rain dripping off her hair, one knee of her work pants dark where she'd gone down on the wet asphalt at some point. She was breathing hard from the sustained effort of it. She looked completely wrecked. She also looked something else. Not exhilarated, nothing that clean, but present in a way that was different from her professional version of present, like something had gotten very stripped down, and what was left was just her, real and solid and soaking wet in a highway. "You good?" he asked. "My knee's gonna hurt tomorrow," she said. "But, yeah." Rudy appeared beside them, water streaming off his hat brim. He looked at Olivia. He looked at the gate. He looked back at Olivia. "That was decent work," he said, which from Rudy was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. Olivia looked at him, slightly too tired to do anything except accept it plainly. "Thank you, Rudy." He nodded and went to check on Pete. They drove back to the house in silence, both of them soaked and cold and running on the specific low-level exhaustion that came after sustained physical stress. Mason cranked the truck heat and didn't say much. Olivia sat with her hands in her lap and looked out the windshield. Inside, Emma was still awake, sitting at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, listening. "Everyone okay?" she said. "Everyone's fine," Mason said. "Cattle are all back. You should be in bed." "I was worried," Emma said, with complete directness. "I know." He went up 2 stairs and kissed the top of her head. "Bed." Emma looked past him at Olivia, who was standing in the entry hall dripping on the welcome mat, looking like she'd been through something. Emma studied her for a moment with those serious 6-year-old eyes. "You saved the cows," Emma said. "Your dad saved the cows," Olivia said. "I just held a flashlight." "You held it for a really long time," Emma said, in a tone that indicated this was a significant contribution. Then she padded back to her room. Olivia stood in the entry hall and looked at the spot where Emma had been, and her face did the thing it sometimes did late at night when nobody was performing anything. It went quiet and real, and just a little bit undone. Mason handed her a towel from the hall closet. Same routine as the first night, weeks ago, but different in every way that mattered. She took it and pressed it against her face, and this time he was pretty certain there was actually something behind it. Not rainwater. He didn't mention it. "Go get warm," he said. "I'll make sure the gate call is logged for the repair crew tomorrow." She pulled the towel down. Her eyes were clear. Whatever they'd been a second ago now contained. But she looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "Mason." "Yeah. She stopped, seemed to reconsider what she'd been about to say, and then said something different, or maybe something more true. "I don't know how to do this. Not really. I keep thinking I have it figured out, and then something else happens, and I realize I'm just making it up as I go." "That's all any of us are doing," he said. "That's not very comforting." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him for another beat. Then something that might have been the beginning of a real smile crossed her face. Tired, not fully formed, but genuine. 5:45, she said. 5:45, he confirmed. She went down the hall. He heard the guest room door close, and then the shower running, and he stood in the entry hall for a moment longer, listening to the storm ease up outside, feeling the quiet of the house settle around him. He was in trouble, and he knew it. Not the legal kind, not the Damien kind. The other kind, the kind that didn't announce itself with a knock at the door or a letter on expensive letterhead, but arrived slowly and without permission through mornings and cattle checks and barn conversations and the specific way a person handed your daughter construction paper scissors and stayed until the diorama was done. He told himself at the beginning that he knew what this was. He was starting to think he'd been wrong about that. He turned off the entry hall light and went to check on Emma one more time, and she was asleep, finally, curled on her side with one arm wrapped around the stuffed rabbit, completely at peace with the world in the way only children could manage. He stood in her doorway and thought about Olivia saying, "The land tells you things when you're on it that it won't tell you from a desk." Her father's words, not hers, but she'd carried them. He thought about Rudy saying that was decent work in the flat, honest way Rudy said things, and what it had cost Olivia to earn those 4 words from a man who gave them out like he was being charged per syllable. He thought about a woman standing in a highway rainstorm holding a flashlight steady for an hour because it needed to be done, and not asking for credit, and not framing it as anything. He turned off Emma's lamp and went to his own room, and lay in the dark, and listened to the storm finish itself outside, and thought about a deal they'd made at a kitchen table in the middle of the night that had been very clear about what it was and what it wasn't. The trouble was, he wasn't sure those categories still held the way they had. The trouble was, he wasn't sure they'd ever fully held. The storm was done by morning. The sky came up clear and cold, the land washed clean and glittering, the air so sharp it almost had a sound to it. Mason was on the porch with coffee at 5:20 when the guest room door opened and Olivia came out. Not late, not early, exactly on time, boots on, hair pulled back, the shadow of last night's exhaustion still under her eyes, but her expression settled, ready. She came out and stopped beside him on the porch and looked at the sky the way she'd started looking at it these days. Not like someone observing scenery, but like someone reading something they were in the middle of. He handed her the second mug without turning his head. She took it. They stood there in the cold, clear morning and watched the light come in across the land, and neither of them said anything. And it was one of those silences that had weight to it. Not empty, not uncomfortable, but full of something that hadn't been named yet and didn't need to be. Not yet. But it was there. The land could tell you things, standing on it, that it wouldn't tell you anywhere else. Mason was starting to understand that this applied to more than just the property. 3 days after the storm, Olivia got the call that the hearing had been moved up. Not postponed, moved up. Damien's lawyers had filed a motion arguing that the extended timeline was causing material harm to the company's operational stability, and the estate judge had agreed to accelerate the schedule. They now had 8 days instead of 3 weeks. Mason was at the kitchen table when she came out of the guest room with the phone still in her hand and her face doing the controlled thing, the professional wall fully up. But he'd been watching her face for over a month now, and he'd learned to read what the wall covered, and what it was covering this time was something close to fear. Not panic. She didn't panic. But fear, the real kind, the kind that lived in the chest and made the next breath just slightly harder than the one before. 8 days, she said. Okay, he said. Then we have 8 days. She sat down at the table. He pulled something, someone in the court system, or someone who knows someone. That motion shouldn't have been granted that fast. Can you challenge it? Our lawyers are looking at it. But even if we could, fighting the scheduling burns time and energy we need for the actual hearing. She pressed her fingers against the table surface, that flat palm gesture she made when she was working something through. He's compressing our preparation time. He knows we were building our documentation case. He's trying to cut that short. What do you have ready right now? 40% of what I wanted. She looked at him. The financial recovery reports are solid. The supplier agreements, the operational schedules, those are done. What I'm still building is the worker testimony section. I wanted depositions from the foreman showing that I've been actively managing the properties. That takes time to do right. Then we get it done in 8 days, Mason said. She looked at him like he'd said something either encouraging or slightly naive, and she hadn't decided which yet. Our lawyers need to draft the depositions, coordinate with the witnesses, review. I know how it works, he said. So does your legal team. Call them now. Tell them what you need and what the timeline is, and let them work. He stood up. And while they're doing that, you come with me. Come with you where? The Bennett properties, the ones closest. Kerrville, the Blanco River operation. You've been going to San Antonio, but you need the foreman on record, and they need to see you on their land, not in a meeting room. On their land. He looked at her steadily. Your father walked the fence lines himself. You know why. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her lawyers. They left at 7 the next morning, Mason driving because he knew the roads through the hill country better, and because Olivia needed to be on her phone for the first hour anyway, working through the documentation logistics with her legal team. Emma was with Carla for the day, which Emma had accepted with the mercenary enthusiasm of someone who knew Carla kept better snacks than Mason did. The Kerrville property was an hour and 20 minutes out, a working cattle and hay operation that Raymond Bennett had built up over 15 years into one of the more efficiently run mid-sized ranches in the region. Mason had known of it by reputation. Seeing it in person, he understood the reputation. He also understood why it was worth fighting for. The foreman there was a man named Tomas Garcia, 50s, weathered, the kind of competent that didn't need to announce itself. He'd been with Bennett Operations for 18 years. He met them at the gate and shook Olivia's hand with the careful respect of someone who had been watching to see what she was made of and was still in the process of deciding. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Tomas." She met his eyes. "How's the South Herd looking after last week's weather?" Something shifted in his expression. Small, but Mason caught it. The fact that she'd known to ask about the South Herd specifically, that she'd kept track of what the Careville property had been managing, that she'd come with a real question instead of a corporate handshake. "Better than expected," Tomas said. "Lost about 3% of the hay stockpile to water damage in the low barn. Otherwise, we're solid." "The low barn has had drainage problems since 2019, Olivia said. "My father kept meaning to address it. I want to get a contractor out there this month. Can you put me in contact with whoever you've been using for infrastructure work?" Tomas looked at her for another beat. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And this time it wasn't careful respect. It was something more straightforward than that. They walked the property for 2 hours. Not a tour, a real walk. Tomas pointing out what was working, what needed attention, what decisions were pending. Olivia asked questions, specific ones, the kind that told him she'd read every operational report the property had filed in the past 2 years. She made notes. She made 2 calls to contractors while standing in a field, setting up assessments. She crouched down next to a section of irrigation line that Tomas mentioned had been giving trouble and looked at it herself rather than just nodding. Mason hung back and let her work. He watched the foreman's posture change over those 2 hours. Not dramatic. Tomas wasn't a dramatic man. But the guardedness came down, degree by degree, the way it did when someone showed you who they were through sustained, patient, competent action, rather than asking you to take it on faith. By the time they got back to the gate, Tomas said, "I'll have my deposition ready for your lawyers by Friday." "Thank you, Tomas." He shook her hand again. This time it felt different. "Your father would have done it the same way," he said. "Just so you know." Olivia held his gaze and nodded once, and Mason could see what that cost her and what it gave her at the same time. The Blanco River property was another 40 minutes south, and they got there in the early afternoon. The foreman there was younger, a woman named Renata Voss, 37, efficient and direct and openly assessing in a way that didn't pretend to be anything else. She'd been with the company for 9 years and had made no secret, according to Olivia, of having concerns about the transition. She met them at the property office and looked at Mason with frank curiosity. "You're the husband," she said. "Mason Cole," he said. "Renata Voss." She looked at Olivia. "You want to walk the east section. We've had some grazing rotation questions I've been handling on my own judgment because there's been no one to run them past." "Show me," Olivia said. They walked for 90 minutes. Renata asked hard questions, not aggressive, but direct, the kind that had no room for vague reassurances. What was the succession plan if the legal challenge went sideways? What happened to worker contracts in that scenario? Whether Olivia had actually read the infrastructure report Renata had filed in September, or whether it had gone into a folder. "I read it," Olivia said. "The water rights section needed flagging. I sent it to our legal team in October." Renata looked at her. "You sent it in October?" "October 14th. You can verify with my assistant." A pause. Renata looked at the middle distance. "I assumed it got lost." "It didn't get lost," Olivia said. "I've been paying attention. I know the response has been slow. In Tsuamo, the transition has created real gaps in communication, and I own that. But I've been here." She held Renata's eyes. "I'm not going anywhere." Renata was quiet for a moment, then said, "The Damien question. If the hearing doesn't go your way." "It's going to go my way," Olivia said. "If it doesn't, then I will fight every subsequent legal avenue available to me for as long as it takes." She said it without heat, just flatly, the way you stated a fact. "This operation is not going to be sold off piece by piece. These jobs are not going to disappear. I will not let that happen." She paused. "I need you to know that's not a campaign promise. It's just what I'm going to do." Renata looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Mason, like she was reading something in the space between them, taking a measurement. "I'll have my deposition to your lawyers by Thursday," she said. On the way back, they stopped at a roadside place for coffee because it was 4 in the afternoon, and they'd both been going since 7, and the coffee was bad, but hot, and they sat across from each other at a small table near the window, and Mason watched Olivia process the day. Tomas's deposition alone is going to help significantly, she said. 18 years with the company, direct testimony of operational communication. That's what our lawyers needed. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Renata's is going to be more complex to frame, but she's credible precisely because she's not a soft witness. Damien can't paint her as a loyal employee saying what she's told to say. She's not, Mason agreed. No. Olivia looked out the window at the parking lot. She asked the real questions, the ones I needed to be asked. She paused. I used to think the hardest part of leadership was making decisions. Now I think it's being actually known, not managed, not positioned, actually known by the people who work for you, so that when you need them to stand behind you, they're standing behind you, not behind a version of you that you constructed for them. Mason looked at her. Your father knew that. He did. She turned her eyes back from the window. I'm still learning it. Most people never learn it at all, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Outside, a truck pulled through the parking lot, the engine loud and then fading. The coffee was bad. The fluorescent light above them flickered once and steadied. Mason, she said. Yeah. I want to say something, and I need you to just let me say it without analyzing it. He waited. The last month, she said, living here, working here, all of it. She stopped, reformulated. I know what the arrangement was. I know what we said it was. But I need you to know that... She stopped again. Her hands tightened around the coffee cup. It's mattered. It's mattered to me in ways that weren't part of the deal. And I don't know what to do with that. And I'm not asking you to do anything about it. I just... She met his eyes. I didn't want to get to the end of this and have you not know. Mason was quiet for a long moment. He thought about 5:45 mornings and barn conversations and a woman standing in a highway rainstorm holding a flashlight steady. He thought about the way she sat on the porch steps when she was too tired to maintain the wall. He thought about Emma's diorama and Rudy's 4 words and the drive where she talked about her father walking the fence lines on Sunday mornings. Olivia, he said, you don't have to... I know, he said. Let me finish. He put his coffee down. I know what the arrangement was, too. And I know when something stopped being an arrangement. She looked at him. I just didn't know if you knew, he said. Something crossed her face that he didn't have a word for. Not relief exactly, not happiness, more like something settling into its right place after being slightly off balance, the way a fence post felt when it finally went in true. She looked back down at her coffee. She didn't say anything else, but her hands relaxed around the cup. They drove back to the ranch in the gathering dark, the hill country rolling past in silhouette against the last light, and they talked about the hearing strategy and the documentation timeline, and which board members Olivia's lawyers were getting statements from, and it was all practical and necessary, and underneath all of it was that conversation at the roadside table, sitting there quiet and present, not resolved exactly but named, which was something. Named was something. The next 6 days were the most compressed Mason could remember since the early years after Sarah died, when every day had felt like 10 because he'd been doing everything alone and grieving at the same time. This was different. They were both moving at full capacity, but they were moving together, which changed the weight of it in ways he felt but didn't have words for yet. Olivia's lawyers worked around the clock. Depositions came in from Tomas Garcia, from Renata Voss, from 2 other foremen whose names Mason learned over kitchen table calls where Olivia would be on speaker while he made dinner, and Emma would occasionally offer commentary from the couch that was accidentally more insightful than it had any right to be. The financial documentation grew into a binder 3 inches thick. Supplier agreements, payment records, operational schedules, infrastructure investment plans with contractor quotes attached. Olivia had spent 12 years learning every corner of that company, and those 12 years were now organized and documented and ready to be placed in front of a judge. Damien's lawyers filed 2 additional motions in the 6 days before the hearing. Mason read the summaries Olivia shared with him, and they were exactly what she'd predicted. Every angle aimed at the same target, which was making her look like a person in crisis rather than a person in control. He's going to make it personal at the hearing, Olivia said the night before. They were at the kitchen table, which had become the de facto war room for the past week, covered in papers and folders, and her laptop and the remains of the dinner they'd eaten while working. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, watching something about ocean animals, and Mason had carried her to bed an hour ago. What does that mean for us? Mason asked. It means he'll talk about the circumstances of the marriage, the timing. He'll imply I was emotionally unstable after my father's death and made a desperate decision. He'll try to make me look small. She straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. He's done it before, in board meetings, in family conversations. He's very good at it. What does he say? She was quiet for a moment. That I'm emotional, that I let feeling get in the way of thinking, that I can't be trusted to make hard calls because I'm always trying to save everybody rather than making the rational decision. She paused. He said it to me in front of our father once, when I was 26. Dad told him to stop. Damien smiled and said he was only being honest. Mason looked at her. And your father? What did he do after that? After Damien left, he told me that Damien's version of rational was what you called it when you didn't care about the right things. Her jaw tightened slightly. Dad said caring about the right things wasn't weakness. He said it was the whole point. He was right, Mason said. I know. She looked at the table. But knowing it doesn't make it easier when someone's saying the other thing out loud in a room full of people. Then you look at him and you say what's true, Mason said. Not what's defensive, not what's designed to counter his specific argument, just what's true. He held her gaze. You know what's true. You've known it your whole career. You've been living it for a month on this ranch. You walked those properties this week, and you knew the workers' names and the drainage problems and the water rights issues. You knew all of it. He paused. That's not someone who lets feeling get in the way of thinking. That's someone who thinks because they feel, which is different, and it's the part he'll never understand. Olivia looked at him for a long moment. When did you get so articulate about this? She said. I've been paying attention, he said. She held his gaze, and there was that thing again. The thing from the roadside coffee place, named now and present in the room with them, not demanding anything, but not pretending not to be there either. I need to sleep, she said. Yeah, he said. 5:45. She almost laughed. Not tomorrow. Hearing's at 10. We leave at 8. 5:45 anyway, he said. Cattle don't know about hearings. She shook her head, but the corner of her mouth was up. She gathered the most essential papers into her briefcase, closed her laptop, and stood up. Then she stopped at the edge of the kitchen and looked back at him. Mason, whatever happens tomorrow, it's going to be fine, he said. You don't know that. No, he said. But I know you. That's close enough. She looked at him one more moment, then went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, in the quiet of the house, listening to it breathe around him, the tick of the old radiator, the sound of wind at the far corner of the roof, the distant sound of the horses. He thought about what tomorrow was, and what it was for, and what was at stake, and he wasn't worried exactly. He was clear, which was something he valued more. He knew what he was going to say when it was his turn to say it. The morning of the hearing, the ranch did what it always did. Cows needed feeding. Troughs needed checking. The horses needed water and the brief human contact they seemed to rely on for their general morale. Mason did all of it at 5:45, and Olivia was beside him, and neither of them talked much, just moved through the familiar routine in the cold morning air, and it grounded them both in different ways. Back at the house, Olivia put on a charcoal suit that had been in her garment bag since she'd arrived. The CEO version of her, the one with the expensive cut and the precise posture. She looked different in it than she had for the past month, more formal, more armored. But she wasn't hiding in it this time. She was using it. Emma was up when they came back inside, eating cereal with slightly too much sugar, wearing her opinion about the day on her face. Where are you going? She asked. Important meeting, Olivia said. Emma looked at her suit. You look different. I'm still the same person. Emma considered this. Then she said, in the tone of someone distributing wisdom, You should tell them about the cows, how you went out in the storm. Olivia blinked. Why? Because you were scared, Emma said simply. I could tell, but you went anyway. She pointed her spoon at Olivia. That's the good kind of brave. You should tell them. Olivia looked at Emma for a moment, and her expression went soft in the way it did when Emma caught her off guard with something real. Okay, she said. I'll think about that. Carla arrived at 7:30 to stay with Emma. She looked at the two of them, at Olivia in the charcoal suit and at Mason in his clean button-down and the good boots, and said nothing, just squeezed Mason's arm once and told them to drive safe. The estate lawyer's office was in San Antonio, in a building that was trying to look distinguished and mostly succeeding. They arrived with 40 minutes to spare, which Olivia used to review her materials one final time while Mason sat beside her in the waiting area and read nothing and thought about what he was going to say and whether it would be enough. Damien arrived 12 minutes before the hearing with 2 lawyers and the body language of someone who had already decided how this ended. He looked at Mason and Olivia sitting together, and his eyes did a quick calculation, and then he smiled. The specific smile from the first day at the ranch, the one that said he was working angles that nobody else could see. "Olivia," he said. "Damien," she said, not looking up from her materials. He looked at Mason. "Nice of you to show up." "Nice to be here," Mason said, and he said it so plainly that Damien didn't have anything to grab onto in it. The hearing was presided over by a man named Harold Finch, the estate lawyer who had handled Raymond Bennett's affairs for over 20 years. He was 68, compact, careful, with the kind of thoroughness that came from decades of watching families come apart over money and land and working hard to give the law the last word. Damien's lawyers went first. They were good. Mason would give them that. The argument was built carefully, moving from the timing of the marriage to the courthouse venue to the emergency waiver to the short timeline of cohabitation, laying each piece down like a foundation, the picture assembling itself into something that looked, from a certain angle, like a transaction wearing a marriage's clothes, Damien testified. He was composed, measured, and managed to sound genuinely concerned about his sister's well-being in a way that Mason found impressive for its complete dishonesty. He talked about their father. He talked about the company's needs. He said the word stability 11 times. Mason counted. Then it was Olivia's turn. She stood up and she was steady. Not rigid, steady, which was different. The difference between something braced against a thing and something rooted enough not to need bracing. She started with the documentation. 3 weeks of operational evidence laid out without drama, paid invoices, repair authorizations, supplier negotiations completed, worker schedules managed, infrastructure assessments initiated. She walked Finch through it methodically, giving him the timeline of every decision she'd made in the past month, every property visit, every call, every crisis handled. Then she set the papers down. "Mr. Finch," she said, "my brother's argument is that this marriage is transactional. I want to address that directly." She paused, not for effect, just to get it right. "Every significant decision I've made in the past 30 days has been made from this ranch. From a home where I've been living, working, eating dinner with a family, getting up at 5:45 in the morning to check cattle in the cold, learning what it means to be responsible for land in the way my father meant when he built this company." She met Finch's eyes. "My father's condition in this will was not designed to be cleared by a legal minimum. I know that. I know it because I knew my father, and he didn't work in legal minimums. He worked in what was real." She paused. "What is real is that I have a husband who has worked beside me for 30 days without asking for anything beyond what we agreed, who has taught me things about this industry and about myself that I needed to know. What is real is a family that I have become part of, not on paper, but in the way it actually happens, which is through shared mornings and bad weather and dinners and showing up when it's inconvenient." She looked at Damien for 1 second and then back at Finch. "My brother wants you to see a transaction. I need you to see a life, because that is what this is." The room was quiet. Damien's lead lawyer started to say something. "I'd like to hear from Mr. Cole," Finch said, and the lawyer sat back down. Mason stood up. He wasn't a man who made speeches. He'd never been comfortable with it, and he didn't try to be comfortable with it now. He just stood there and told the truth. "I'm a rancher," he said. "I'm a widowed father. I wasn't looking for a marriage arrangement, and I wasn't looking for anything else. Olivia came to my door because she needed help, and I said yes because the situation was real and the stakes were real, and she was honest with me about both." He paused. "Since she's been at the ranch, she has worked. She has shown up at 5:45 every morning without being asked twice after the first day. She has mucked boots and fixed fences and learned which cattle are antisocial and which are sick. She drove to her properties and walked the land with the foreman and asked the right questions and made the repair calls. She held a flashlight in a highway rainstorm for an hour and 20 minutes because the cattle needed to come back through, and that's what the situation needed." He looked at Finch. "I have a 6-year-old daughter. She is the most important thing in my world, and she has watched this woman be present in our home every day for a month, and she trusts her. My daughter does not trust easily. She doesn't extend that to people who don't mean it." He stopped. "Damien Bennett wants this company because it's worth money. Olivia Bennett wants it because it's worth something else. I have watched both of them up close, and the difference is not subtle." He sat down. The room was quiet again. Finch looked at the documentation. He looked at his notes. He looked at Damien, and then at Olivia, and then briefly at Mason. Damien's lawyer made a final argument about the technical language of the wills clause, which was competent and pointless because the facts were the facts, and the facts didn't leave a lot of room. Finch listened. Then he took his glasses off, which seemed to be his version of signaling that the professional portion was complete and the human portion was about to speak. "Mr. Bennett," he said to Damien, "I knew your father for 22 years. I wrote this will. I know exactly what Raymond intended by this condition." He put his glasses back on. He intended for operational control to go to someone who had a life that was real, a life that was anchored in something beyond the company itself. He was not trying to exclude your sister from leadership. He was trying to ensure she had something to be stable for, because he understood, as I think most people who knew Raymond understood, that the worst thing that could happen to Olivia was that the company became her only world. He opened the folder in front of him. "The challenge is denied. Operational control of Bennett Corporation is confirmed in Olivia Bennett's name, effective as of the original will's transfer date." He looked at Olivia. "Congratulations, Ms. Bennett. Your father would be proud." Damien sat very still. His lawyers were already leaning toward him, murmuring, beginning to rebuild toward the next angle. But the expression on his face, just for one unguarded second before he covered it, was not one of someone recalculating strategy. It was one of someone who had genuinely believed he would win and hadn't. Olivia sat with her hands flat on the table and she breathed, and the composure was fully in place and her face told nothing, but her hands were shaking, slightly, just slightly, the way they did when something had cost everything and finally come through. Mason put his hand over hers on the table. Not dramatically, just set it there, warm and steady. She didn't move her hand. Outside the window, San Antonio moved on the way cities did. Traffic, people, the indifferent ordinary machinery of a world that didn't know and didn't need to know what had just happened in a room on the 14th floor. Damien stood up without looking at either of them and left with his lawyers, and the door closed behind him. Finch packed his folder. He shook Olivia's hand, then Mason's. He said something brief and professional and left them alone in the room. And then it was just the two of them, in the quiet, with the city going on below and the papers spread on the table and the month behind them and the question of what came next. Olivia looked at her hands, then she looked at Mason. "It's done," she said. "Yeah," he said. She pressed her lips together. Something behind her eyes moved, complex, layered. Everything she'd held down for 8 days of compressed preparation and a month before that of fighting on every front, and the 7 months of grief before that, and 12 years of building something she'd almost lost. "I don't," she started. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "I want to." He waited. "I don't know what I thought this was going to be when I showed up at your door," she said. "I was so focused on the problem I was solving that I didn't think about anything else." She stopped. "I'm glad I didn't think too much about it. I would have talked myself out of it." "Out of the whole thing?" he said. "Out of asking you," she said. "Out of believing anyone would say yes." She held his gaze. "I'm glad you said yes, Mason." He looked at her, at the charcoal suit and the smudged, slightly tiredness under her eyes, and the person he'd been watching for a month, who had shown up every morning at 5:45 and never once made it look like anything other than what it was, which was real. "Come on," he said, standing up and gathering the papers into the briefcase. "Emma's going to want to hear how it went, and if we don't get back before dinner, she'll have opinions about the lasagna that we're going to have to hear in detail." Olivia looked up at him. "I'm serious about the ricotta," he said. She laughed. "A real one, full and unguarded. The kind that changed the whole room, the kind that Mason had first heard in the kitchen weeks ago and hadn't been able to stop thinking about since." "Let's go home," she said. He didn't catch himself using the word this time. Neither did she. They drove back to the ranch with the windows cracked despite the cold, because Olivia said she needed the air, and Mason understood that without needing an explanation. The hill country rolled past them in the late afternoon light, cedar and limestone and the long gold grass of November, the sky going pink and orange at the edges the way it did this time of year, like the day was taking its time leaving. Neither of them talked much for the first 30 minutes, not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much, and neither of them was the kind of person who rushed at things like that. Eventually, Olivia said, "What happens now?" Mason kept his eyes on the road. "What do you mean? With the company, with the board? Damien's not going to accept this quietly." She was looking out the passenger window, her reflection ghosted against the glass. "He'll regroup, he'll find another angle. He always does." "Probably," Mason said, "but it'll be a different kind of fight. The legal ground is gone. He can maneuver around the edges, but he can't challenge the core of it anymore." He paused. "And now you have the depositions on record. Tomas, Renata, the others. That's not just court documentation. Those are relationships. He can't undo those." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "Harlan Whitmore is still on the board." "Then you deal with Whitmore," Mason said. "One thing at a time." She turned her head to look at him. "You make it sound simple." "I know it's not simple," he said. "But you know what you're doing now in a way you didn't a month ago. Not because you learned something you didn't know. You already knew the company. But because you've been doing it from a place that isn't just about the company. And that's different." He glanced at her. "You told Finch your father didn't work in legal minimums. He worked in what was real. That's what you're doing now." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the road ahead of them. "He would have liked you," she said. "Yeah?" "He respected people who said what they meant without making it a performance." She paused. "That was harder to find than you'd think, at his level. Everyone was always positioning. He used to say he could count on one hand the people who'd tell him something real without calculating what it would cost them first." Mason didn't say anything to that, just drove and let the quiet hold it. They got back to the ranch at 6:15. The light was almost gone by then, the last of it sitting low on the horizon, and the property emerged out of the dusk the way it always did. The barn, the fence lines, the cedar trees at the edge, the farmhouse with its kitchen window lit warm and yellow. Carla's car was still in the drive, which meant Emma hadn't let her leave yet, which meant something interesting had happened in their absence. Mason pulled up, and they hadn't even gotten the truck doors open before the front door banged open, and Emma came down the porch steps at a speed that suggested significant news. "You won," she said. Not a question. Mason looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because Olivia's not doing her serious face," Emma said, with the confidence of someone who had studied the data. She looked at Olivia. "You're not doing your serious face." Olivia crouched down to Emma's level, which she'd started doing naturally somewhere around week 2, and said, "We won." Emma considered this for exactly 1 second, and then launched herself at Olivia with the full-body commitment of a 6-year-old who had decided that hug was happening. Olivia caught her, off balance slightly, and wrapped both arms around her, and Mason watched his daughter's face pressed against Olivia's shoulder, and Olivia's eyes closed for just a second and thought, "There it is. There is exactly the thing." Carla appeared in the doorway, holding a dish towel, watching. She met Mason's eyes and said nothing, but her expression said something his mother probably would have said if his mother had still been around to say it. "I made lasagna," Carla said, "with the correct amount of ricotta." "Finally," Emma said from inside the hug. "I used the correct amount," Mason said. "You used too much," Emma and Carla said at the same time, and then looked at each other with the satisfaction of people who had been vindicated by numbers. Mason shook his head and went inside. Dinner was loud and good, in the way family dinners were, when everyone was finally in the same room after something hard had finished. Emma dominated the conversation with a report on what she and Carla had done during the day, which had involved teaching Biscuit a trick that Biscuit had then refused to perform on command and only performed spontaneously, which Emma described as basically the same thing. Carla corrected the record on 2 points. Emma disputed both corrections. Olivia sat in her usual chair at the table with her jacket still on because she'd forgotten to take it off, and she ate Carla's lasagna, which was, in fairness, slightly better than Mason's, though he would not be saying that out loud. And she watched the noise of the table with an expression that was open in a way her face wasn't always open, like something she'd been bracing for a long time had finally been allowed to come down. Carla left at 8, pulling Mason aside at the door for exactly 12 seconds to say, "Don't overthink it," which was her version of extensive emotional counsel. Emma went to bed at 8:30 without much resistance, which was so unusual that Mason checked her forehead for fever. "I'm not sick," Emma said. "I'm just tired. Today was a lot." "For you?" Mason said. "You were here the whole day." "I was worried," Emma said. "Worrying is tiring." He tucked her in and kissed her forehead, and she grabbed his hand briefly, the way she sometimes did, just for a second. A quick grip and release, checking that he was solid, that the world was still the right shape. "Is Olivia going to stay?" Emma said, not looking at him, eyes on the ceiling. Mason sat on the edge of the bed. He thought about how to answer that honestly, which was what he'd always tried to do with Emma, even when it would have been easier not to. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I hope so." Emma processed this. "Me too," she said. Then, "Her serious face is less scary than it used to be." "It was never scary," Mason said. "It was a little bit scary," Emma said, "at the beginning, but now it's just her face." She yawned. "I like her face." Mason stood up. "Go to sleep." "I'm already mostly asleep," Emma said, which was true. He turned off the lamp and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at his daughter in the dark, and thought about how much she saw and how much she understood and how completely she trusted the things she decided to trust. He'd spent 4 years trying to protect that in her, that capacity for straightforward love, uncomplicated, not pre-defended against hurt the way adult love had to learn to be. He hoped he hadn't messed that up. He went back to the kitchen. Olivia was at the table, jacket finally off, the remains of the evening spread around her, Emma's school papers, Carla's casserole dish waiting to be returned, 2 glasses of water nobody had drunk. She'd taken her hair down from the professional knot, and it was loose around her shoulders, and she was looking at her phone with her reading glasses on, which was a thing Mason had only recently discovered she had, because she never wore them except late at night when she thought she was alone. She looked up when he came in. "Emma okay?" she asked. "She asked if you were staying," he said. Olivia went still. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," he said. "That I didn't know, but I hoped so." He sat down across from her. Not the length of the table between them. He pulled the chair around to the corner so they were close, which he hadn't planned to do but did anyway. "We should talk about it," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment, then at her. "The arrangement was what it was," he said. "You needed help. I needed help. We helped each other. That part's done." He paused. "But the other part, the part that wasn't the arrangement, that's not done. For me, it isn't." Olivia held his gaze. "Mason?" "Let me finish," he said. She closed her mouth. "I'm not a complicated man," he said. "I know that's not true of everyone, but it's true of me. I know what I feel when I feel it, and I usually know pretty quickly whether it's real or whether it's just convenience or proximity or whatever else. I've had enough of both to know the difference." He looked at her steadily. "What I feel about you is not proximity. It's not gratitude for what you did for the ranch, or some reaction to having another adult in the house after 4 years of not having one. It's you, the person you actually are, which I've had a month to watch, which is more honest of you than most people get of each other in twice that time, because we've been living in the same house and there's nowhere to hide." He stopped. "I fell in love with you somewhere in the middle of all of it, and I don't know exactly when, and I'm not going to pretend I have some perfect speech about what that means going forward, but I needed you to know it. Ishiwai wam os borelin." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was light against the windows, nothing like the storms that had marked this month. The refrigerator hummed. The old clock on the wall ticked. Olivia looked at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that she wasn't going to be able to explain away as something else, and her hands on the table were not pressed flat and controlled. They were just her hands, open, unmanaged. "I have a whole company," she said. Her voice was steady, but only just. "I have a board that's partially hostile, a brother who's going to spend the next year looking for the next angle, properties in 3 counties that need active management, workers who need visible leadership." She paused. "My life is complicated, Mason. It's not going to get simpler." "I know," he said. "And you have this ranch. Emma, the fence that still needs work in the south pasture." The corner of her mouth moved. 5:45. "Every morning," he confirmed. "That's a lot of different directions," she said. Yeah, he said, it is. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm not easy, she said. I work too much, and I go quiet when I should talk, and I have strong opinions about things that most people don't care about, and I'm still figuring out how to be a person in a home instead of a professional in a building. She stopped. I've been figuring that out for the past month, actually. Here. I know, he said again. And that doesn't worry you? Olivia, he said, I watched you hold a flashlight steady in a highway rainstorm for an hour and 20 minutes because a scared steer needed to come home. I watched you crouch down in a field and actually look at an irrigation line instead of just nodding at it. I watched you sit on the porch steps after a hard phone call and just be honest about it instead of pretending you were fine. He held her gaze. None of that worries me. All of that is exactly what I want. He paused. You're not a project. You're not someone who needs fixing. You're just you. And you being you is enough, more than enough. She pressed her lips together hard, like she was doing something specific about what was happening behind her eyes. My father used to say, she started, then stopped, then started again. He used to say that the right person for you was someone who made the ground feel more solid, not less. That you'd know them because the world was a little bit steadier when they were in it. Her voice had gone quiet. I've been walking on unsteady ground for 7 months, Mason. For longer than that, honestly. But since that first morning on your porch, even in the middle of all of it, I've felt the ground. The words sat between them. He reached across and took her hand off the table. Not dramatic, just picked it up. The way you picked up something that belonged in your hand and held it. Her fingers tightened around his almost immediately, and the tightness of it said everything that the long, careful sentences had been working toward. They sat like that for a while, at the corner of the kitchen table, in the quiet of the house that had been his alone for 4 years, and had felt, for the past month, like something was finally filling back in. Not replaced. Nothing ever replaced what had been, but filled in, the way land eventually filled back in after a hard season, changed, but alive again. So, Olivia said, after a while. Her voice had come back to something steadier. So, he said. This is real, she said. Not a question, a confirmation. Yeah, he said, this is real. She looked at their hands. I have a board meeting in San Antonio on Monday. I need to address the Whitmore situation directly before Damien gets to him again. I'm thinking I take Renata with me. Her deposition carried weight, and having her in the room as a visible ally changes the conversation. That's a good call, Mason said. I'll be back Tuesday evening. She looked up at him. If that's... Carla can get Emma from school, he said. And you don't need to ask if that's okay, Olivia. This is your home. You come back when you're done. She looked at him when he said that. Just looked, straight and clear. I keep waiting for it to feel presumptuous, she said, calling it that. Stop waiting, he said. Something unknotted in her face. Okay, she said. The weeks that followed were not simple. Mason had never expected them to be, and the fact that they weren't didn't shake anything loose. It just confirmed that they were living in the actual version of things, not a version someone had cleaned up for presentation. Olivia went to San Antonio 3 times a week, sometimes 4. The Whitmore situation resolved slower than she'd hoped. Harlan Whitmore was 70 years old and had his own ideas about how things should be ordered, and he didn't shift quickly, and there were 2 board meetings that left Olivia coming home with that jaw-set look that Mason had learned to handle by having coffee ready and giving her 30 minutes of porch time before asking anything. She won Whitmore over in the end, not by outmaneuvering him, but by sitting down with him privately, without lawyers or positioning, and asking him to walk her through his specific concerns one at a time. She told Mason about it afterward, sitting at the kitchen table, slightly exhausted and slightly surprised by herself. He just needed to know I wasn't going to dismantle what my father built, she said. All the political maneuvering, the block Damien was building. Harlan didn't actually want what Damien was selling. He was just scared of instability. She shook her head. I should have done that conversation 2 months ago. You did it when you were ready to do it right, Mason said. That's generous. That's accurate, he said. 2 months ago, you were still figuring out who you were in that company. You couldn't have made him believe you then because you weren't all the way sure yourself. He looked at her. You are now. She held his gaze. You pay too much attention, she said, but there was nothing complaining in it. Told you, he said. Character flaw. Damien made 2 more moves in the 2 months following the hearing. The first was a quiet campaign with 2 of the company's major suppliers, suggesting Olivia's operational approach was too conservative, too focused on worker welfare at the expense of margin efficiency. The second was a press placement, a short item in a regional business publication that described Bennett Corporation's leadership transition as turbulent and quoted unnamed sources inside the company. Olivia handled both with the specific patience of someone who had learned not to swing at every pitch. For the supplier situation, she flew out personally and sat down with both suppliers' leadership teams, brought Tomas Garcia to the first meeting because his operational credibility was unimpeachable, and spent 6 hours over 2 days making the case in numbers. Both suppliers reaffirmed their contracts. One of them called her afterward to say they'd been approached with what they described as misleading information and wanted her to know they'd declined it. For the press item, she said nothing publicly. She called 3 journalists she had existing relationships with and pitched them a story about the Bennett Properties worker retention rate, one of the highest in the regional industry, and the company's infrastructure reinvestment program. 2 of them ran pieces that were factually accurate and made the turbulent framing look thin by comparison. "You didn't fight him," Mason said when she told him. "Fighting him in public is what he wants," she said. "He wants the noise. He wants it to look like a family dispute so he can position himself as the reasonable alternative." She shook her head. "The only way to beat Damien is to make him irrelevant. And the only way to make him irrelevant is to be so clearly competent in every visible direction that his noise doesn't have anywhere to land." "That sounds exhausting," Mason said. "It is," she said simply. "But it works." Rudy, who had watched all of this from the particular vantage point of a man who showed up at 5:30 every morning and paid attention to everything and said approximately 40 words a day, offered his assessment one afternoon in January, while he and Mason were replacing a section of the north fence that had finally given up the argument. "She's solid," Rudy said. Mason drove a post. "Yeah, first week I wasn't sure." Rudy handed him the post pounder. "Second week I was starting to think so. Third week, after the storm, I was sure." "What made you sure?" Mason said. Rudy thought about it the way he thought about most things, which was carefully and without hurry. "She didn't try to prove anything after," he said. "Just kept showing up. People who are performing something, they need you to acknowledge the performance. She just kept showing up." Mason looked at him. "That's pretty observant for a man who says 4 words a day." "I'm not a talker," Rudy said. "Doesn't mean I'm not watching." He took the post pounder back and got to work, and that was the end of that conversation, which was also very Rudy. Emma had her own way of processing the change, which was typically Emma, direct and unsentimental, and also somehow the most perceptive read of the situation available. She stopped calling Olivia Olivia sometime in December, not consciously it seemed, just gradually. The name dropping away and being replaced with a kind of direct address that didn't need a name because the relationship was implied. "Can you help me with this? Look at what I made. You said we could go to the feed store on Saturday." She filed Olivia into the category of person whose presence was expected and whose absence would be noted, and whose opinions on ricotta, while wrong, were to be respected. She didn't call her mom. That was not what it was, and Emma, being Emma, knew the difference. But it was something real and specific and hers, that she'd decided on without being told how to feel about it. One evening in February, Olivia was at the kitchen table helping Emma with a reading assignment, something about ecosystems, which Emma found both interesting and an opportunity for tangential questions about whether sharks could survive in Texas if it flooded enough. And Mason was at the counter making dinner, and he had one of those moments that came without warning, where you suddenly saw the scene you were standing in with a kind of clarity that caught you off guard. His kitchen. His daughter. The woman who had knocked on his door in a storm 4 months ago, now sitting at his table with her reading glasses on, explaining the food chain to a 6-year-old who had strong opinions about where sharks fit in it. He stood there for a second with a spatula in his hand and felt the weight of the simple rightness of it. Not perfect, nothing was perfect. Tomorrow there would be a board call and a fence that needed checking, and Emma would probably have a complaint about something, and Olivia would go quiet about something she should talk about, and he'd have to wait her out. That was the actual texture of it, the real version, not the cleaned up one. But it was his, it was theirs, that was the thing. "Dad," Emma said without looking up from the book. "You're burning the onions." He turned back to the stove. "I'm not burning the onions. I can smell them. They're caramelizing." That's what you called it last time, too. Olivia pressed her lips together, eyes on the book, saying nothing. I can see your face, he told her. I'm not doing anything with my face, she said. You're doing something with your face. I'm helping with the food chain, she said, with perfect composure. Emma pointed at a page. Can we get back to the sharks? April came in with warm days and cold nights, and the particular beauty of Texas spring, which was brief and extravagant, and knew it. The ranch looked different in the spring, the grass coming back, the cedar going a deeper green, the horses restless with the change in air and inclined to run if you let them. Olivia had been managing the Kerrville Properties infrastructure project herself for 2 months now, driving out twice a week to oversee the drainage work and the barn renovation that had been deferred since 2019. Tomas had stopped calling it Ms. Bennett's project and started calling it our project, somewhere around the 3rd week, which Olivia had mentioned to Mason with a casualness that didn't entirely hide how much it meant. The Blanco River property was running a pilot grazing rotation that Renata had proposed, and Olivia had approved and funded over the objections of 2 board members who thought the cost-benefit analysis wasn't there. The early results were strong. Renata had called with the February numbers in a tone of voice that said she'd known it would work but was professionally satisfied to be right, and Olivia had called Mason from the San Antonio office parking lot because she'd needed to tell someone, and the someone she wanted to tell was him. The numbers are good, she'd said. Renata's numbers are really good. I know, he said. You told me she was right about this. I know I did, she said. I just wanted to say it out loud to someone who actually... She stopped. Who actually knows what it means, he said. Yeah, that was February. By April, she was doing that easily, calling from parking lots and supplier offices, and the side of a county road where she'd pulled over to look at a fence problem on the Kerrville property's edge. Not always with news, sometimes just because. Mason did the same, which he hadn't expected of himself. One Saturday in April, all 4 of them, Mason, Olivia, Emma, and Carla, who had been adopted into the day without formal invitation, drove out to a section of the Bennett land near the Blanco River that Olivia had been wanting to see in the spring. Tomas had mentioned the bluebonnets that came in along the southern edge every year, said it was something, and Olivia had wanted to see it. They parked at the edge of the pasture and walked the fence line south, and Tomas had been right. The bluebonnets came in thick along the lower section where the land dipped toward the river, a wide band of blue-purple in the spring grass, the river glinting beyond them, the sky the specific shade of Texas April blue that photographers tried for and usually didn't quite catch. Emma immediately lay down in them, face up, arms out, in the manner of someone making a snow angel but with flowers. Emma, the bees, Olivia started. The bees are not bothering me, Emma said serenely. That's because you're lying very still. I know, Emma said. I'm being respectful of the bees. Carla sat on the tailgate of the truck with her coffee and watched all of this with the expression of someone who was storing it away carefully. Mason stood at the fence line and looked out at the river and the land, and Olivia came and stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching. My father came here in the spring, she said. Every year, he said. He brought my mother here when they were first together, before the company was anything much, when it was still just a small operation and they weren't sure it would work. She looked at the bluebonnets, at Emma lying among them talking to the bees. He said this was the place that made him sure it was worth it, not the numbers, just this. Mason looked at the land. It was good land, the kind that had its own character, its own history in it, the kind you could feel when you stood on it. He was right, Mason said. She leaned into him, slightly, shoulder against his arm, and he put his arm around her because that was the natural thing to do, and they stood there at the fence line of her family's land in the April sun while Emma reasoned peacefully with the bees and Carla drank her coffee on the tailgate and the river went on doing what rivers did. It wasn't the moment he told her he loved her. He'd done that months ago, quietly, at a kitchen table. And she'd said it back in the way she said things that mattered, which was carefully, with full weight, like the words meant exactly what they were supposed to mean. This was a different kind of moment, not the first time or the most dramatic, just the kind that stayed with you, the ordinary ones, the ones that didn't announce themselves as significant, but that you found yourself returning to later, years later, because they were when you felt it most clearly. When you understood what you had. What Mason understood standing there was this. He had spent 4 years building a life that was functional. A good life, actually, in most of the ways that mattered. He'd kept the ranch. He'd raised Emma well. He'd done the work that needed doing and asked for no more than his share. But functional was not the same as full. And he hadn't known exactly how empty the space was until it wasn't. Olivia had shown up at his door in a storm with a desperate plan and a folder of documents and wet shoes and something real behind the composure, and she had stayed. Not because the arrangement required it anymore, but because she was someone who, once she belonged to something, belonged to it completely. The ranch, the company, Emma, him. That was who she was. It had taken him about 2 weeks to see it and the rest of the time to accept what it meant. What it meant was that the lonely life he'd learned to accept as the shape of things was simply gone. Not because something had fixed him or saved him or arrived like an answer to a question he'd been asking, but because two broken, imperfect, stubborn people had made a deal in a kitchen during a storm and then had the strange grace to actually see each other while they were keeping it. On the drive back, Emma fell asleep in the back seat between Carla and Olivia's jacket, and the radio was turned low, and the hill country rolled past in the late afternoon light. "I need to tell you something," Olivia said. "Okay," he said. "The lawyers finalized the financial transfer this week. The ranch debt." She looked at him. "It's done. Everything we agreed to is settled." He kept driving. "Okay, I want to make sure you know that the deal is closed. That nothing you're doing now is because of it, or because of any obligation." She paused. "I need you to know the door's open, Mason, whatever you want the next part to look like." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what I want it to look like," he said. "I know," she said. "I just needed to say it." "Because you needed to know it was a choice," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached over without taking his eyes off the road, found her hand, held it. "It's a choice," he said. "It's been a choice since about week 3. She held his hand and looked out the windshield, and after a while she said, "I'm not easy." "You said that before," he said. "It bears repeating," she said. "So am I," he said. "Not easy. I'm stubborn, and I'm up before 5, and I have opinions about how a ranch should be run, and I don't say enough sometimes when I should talk more." "You say exactly enough," she said. Carla would disagree with that. "Carla thinks everyone should talk more," Olivia said. "It's a specific bias." In the back seat, Emma made a sleeping child sound and shifted against Carla's shoulder without waking. Mason looked at the road ahead, at the last of the sunlight on the hill country, at the long, familiar curve of the land he'd spent years learning, and the woman beside him who was still learning it and would keep learning it because that was who she was. And he thought about a door that had opened in a storm and all the things that had come through it since, the hard ones and the real ones and the ones he hadn't expected and wouldn't trade. He thought about Rudy saying the ground's still solid in his 4-word way, and Emma telling Olivia to tell them about the flashlight because the good kind of brave was going anyway, and Tomas shaking Olivia's hand the second time with more in it than the first, and Renata's voice on the phone when the numbers came through. He thought about what Olivia had said at the fence line, the place that made her father sure it was worth it. Not the numbers, just this. He thought that was exactly right. Some things you only understood from inside them, from being in the mud of them, the cold of them, the long, ordinary days of them. The deals you made that turned into something else. The arrangements that became homes. The strangers who knocked on your door in the middle of a storm and ended up being the reason the house felt like a house again. Life didn't give you those things on a schedule, and it didn't give them out equally, and it had absolutely no regard for whether you were ready. But sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes, it gave you a storm and a door and someone on the other side of it who needed something real, and you said yes, and the rest of it came from that. The rest of it had to come from that. Because that was where it started. At a door. In the dark. With rain coming down hard and a woman who had run out of every other option standing there asking for the one thing she couldn't manufacture on her own, which was someone willing to show up and mean it. Mason Cole had opened the door. He was glad he had. He would keep being glad about it for the rest of his life, which was, from where he sat on a farm road in April with the sun going down, and his daughter asleep in the back and Olivia's hand in his, shaping up to be exactly the kind of life He hadn't known how to want until it was already happening. Which, he had come to understand, was usually how the right things arrived. Not announced, not on time, just real. Just finally, undeniably, solidly real.